Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. Even now, typing this out, my hands feel a bit shaky. What happened to my family and me wasn't just one incident. It was years of encounters. But there's one day in particular I need to get off my chest. First, some background. My name's Dave. In 1978, when I was 12, my dad and I moved to this massive 236-acre property in Pope Valley. It's in the hills above Napa Valley, toward Lake Berryessa in California. Beautiful country, but isolated, really isolated. My dad went ahead with me while my mom and siblings were supposed to join us later after we got things set up. That first week was just me and Dad working on the place. We were staying in this little cabin that needed a ton of work. Dad had laid fresh gravel around the front so we wouldn't track mud everywhere during the rainy season. Anyway, I'm getting to the day that changed everything. It was summer 1987. I was 21 by then, and I'd spent nearly a decade hearing weird stuff around our property, but never actually seeing what was causing it. Over the years, we'd found massive footprints near the creek. Sometimes we'd hear these ungodly screams at night that'd make the hair on your neck stand up, not like a mountain lion or coyote, something different. And that smell. If you've ever smelled it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like a skunk mixed with wet dog and something rotten. When that stink showed up, it would hang around for half an hour or more. Dad had seen something run away that first week we moved in. Told me about hearing footsteps in the gravel, going outside with his flashlight and catching a glimpse of something big disappearing into the trees. He didn't say much more than that, but I could tell it shook him up. Over the years, our family had accepted these weird occurrences as just part of living out there. The summer visitors, Mom jokingly called them, though she didn't think it was funny when they'd wake us up at 3 a.m. with their rock throwing or wood knocking. We'd have maybe 2 or 3 incidents each summer, sometimes with a gap of a couple years where nothing happened at all. But back to that day in '87, my buddy Chris had driven up from the city to hang out for the weekend. It was late July, crazy hot, like 95 degrees. We'd spent the morning helping my dad fix fencing on the north side of the property, then came back to cool off. My parents had built a proper house by then, with a big wraparound porch that faced the valley. Around sunset, Chris and I were sitting out there drinking beers, just shooting the shit and watching the light change over the hills. The property had this gradual slope that went down maybe 200 yards to a creek bed, then rose back up to create this crest about a quarter mile from the house. There were oak trees scattered around, but that far hillside was pretty exposed, just tall grass and a few boulders. We were mid-conversation about some girl Chris was dating when I noticed movement at the top of that far ridge. At first, I thought it was a deer. We had tons of them around the property, but this was bigger, and it was moving weird. "Hey, what's that?" I said, pointing. Chris squinted. "Probably just..." Then he stopped talking. The thing came fully into view at the top of the crest. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive. It was standing upright, walking on 2 legs, and it was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. It had this smooth gait, swinging its long arms. "What the fuck is that?" Chris whispered. The setting sun was behind us, so we had a clear view while the thing was looking into the sun. It took maybe 5 more steps before it seemed to notice us sitting there. It stopped dead in its tracks. For maybe 5 seconds, couldn't have been more than 10, we just stared at each other. It was covered in this grayish-brown hair all over its body. Not fur exactly, more like hair. Its arms hung down past its knees. I remember thinking it must be 7 feet tall at minimum. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but it wasn't a bear either, no way. Then without warning it turned and ran. Holy shit, could that thing move? It didn't run like a person jogging. It was like watching an NFL linebacker at full sprint. This powerful athletic movement that covered ground incredibly fast. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the tree line at the edge of our property. Chris and I just sat there, completely silent for what felt like forever. My beer was still halfway to my mouth. "Did you see that?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it." "Was that a... I couldn't even say the word. Sasquatch. Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. After 9 years of weird sounds, smells, and footprints, I'd finally seen one with my own eyes, and I had a witness. We went inside and told my parents. Dad just nodded like he'd been expecting this day to come. Mum looked worried. My younger brother thought we were making it up, but Chris and I knew what we'd seen. That night, none of us slept well. Around 2 a.m., I was still wide awake when I heard something on the roof. Not like an animal scurrying. These were deliberate, heavy steps. Thump, thump, pause, thump, moving from one end of the house to the other. I got out of bed and went to Chris in the guest room. He was already sitting up, eyes wide. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded. "It's on the damn roof." We crept down the hallway to my parents' room. Dad was already up, loading his shotgun. "Stay inside," he told us. "I'm just going to fire a warning shot if I need to." Mom was sitting up in bed, looking terrified. "Dave, get your brother," she said. I went to get my 14-year-old brother from his room. He was sound asleep somehow, and I had to shake him awake. When he finally opened his eyes, I could see he was annoyed until another loud thump came from directly overhead. His eyes went wide. "What is that?" he whispered. "Just come with me," I said, pulling him out of bed. We all gathered in my parents' room. My mom, brother, Chris, and me. Dad stood by the window with his shotgun, peering out between the curtains. The thumping continued for another minute or so, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. "Is it gone?" my brother asked. Before anyone could answer, a terrible smell seeped in through the open window. That unmistakable stench I'd smelled so many times before, but stronger than ever. It was so powerful I had to cover my nose with my shirt. Then we heard it, a deep, rumbling sound from just outside the window. Not quite a growl, not quite human. Something between a hum and a moan that seemed to vibrate the glass. Dad raised his shotgun slightly. "Don't," Mom whispered, grabbing his arm. "Please don't provoke it." The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eventually, Dad lowered the gun and said, "I think it's moved off." None of us slept in our own rooms that night. My brother and I camped out on the living room floor while my parents took the couch. Chris curled up in a recliner. Every creak of the house made us jump. At dawn, Dad and I went outside to look around. The roof had these weird scuff marks like something had been walking up there. And all around the house, especially near my parents' bedroom window, the ground was disturbed. Not clear footprints. The soil was too hard from the summer heat, but definite impressions of something large. But what really got me was the tree line at the edge of our cleared yard. Several branches were broken about 8 feet up, way higher than any of us could reach. And caught on one of the broken branches was a tuft of that same grayish-brown hair we'd seen on the creature. I reached up and carefully removed it. It was coarse, but not like animal fur. More like really thick human hair. Dad looked at it and just shook his head. "What do we do with it?" I asked. He thought for a moment, then said, "Nothing. We're not scientists. We're not hunters. We just live here. And so do they, I guess." "They?" The plural made my stomach drop. Dad just nodded toward the distant ridge where we'd seen the creature the evening before. "Don't think there's just one. Over the years, The noises come from different directions sometimes. Different sizes of prints, too. Chris left later that morning. He was pretty shaken up, and honestly, I don't blame him. He came back to visit a few more times over the years, but never stayed overnight again. That summer, the activity around our property intensified. It was like once they knew we'd seen them, they didn't bother being as secretive. We'd hear wood knocks almost every night, loud whacks that would echo through the valley. Sometimes they'd throw rocks onto the roof or porch. Once, something hurled a massive log against the side of the house so hard it cracked one of the exterior boards. We started talking to our neighbors about it. Turned out we weren't the only ones experiencing weird stuff. The Petersons, who lived about 3 miles down the valley, told us about something trying to get into their house one night. Mr. Peterson fired his gun into the air, and whatever it was ran off into the woods, moving faster than any person could. The Richardsons, who ran cattle on their property, had problems with their livestock being harassed. They thought it was teenagers at first, until Mr. Richardson saw what was doing it, described the same type of creature we'd seen. The weirdest part about that summer, though, was how the creatures seemed to be watching us, learning our routines. If we went to town on Tuesdays, they'd be more active on Tuesdays for a while, like they knew the property would be empty. If we started using the back door more often, we'd find more evidence of activity near the back of the house. One evening in August, about 3 weeks after our first sighting, I was out on the porch alone. It was getting dark, but there was still enough light to see across the property. I had my camera with me, an old Nikon my dad had given me. I'd taken to keeping it nearby, hoping to get proof if I ever saw one of them again. I was just sitting there, watching the ridge where we'd seen the creature before, when I noticed movement in a much closer stand of trees, maybe 100 yards from the house. I slowly raised the camera, trying not to make any sudden movements. Through the viewfinder, I could make out a shape partially hidden behind an oak tree. It was big, and it was watching me. I could see an arm, long and muscular, covered in that same hair, gripping the trunk of the tree. And just visible at the edge of the trunk was what looked like a face. Not human, but not like any animal I knew either. The eye that I could see reflected the last bit of daylight, gleaming back at me. My finger hovered over the shutter button, trembling slightly. I knew this was my chance to get proof. But something stopped me. A feeling in my gut that taking that picture would cross some line. As if reading my thoughts, the creature stepped fully behind the tree, obscuring itself completely. But it didn't leave. I could feel it watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I lowered the camera slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said quietly, feeling stupid talking to the woods. "This is your home too." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard a soft knock from the direction of the tree. Not loud and aggressive like the ones we'd hear at night, but almost conversational. I don't know how else to describe it. Without really thinking about it, I picked up my empty beer bottle and gently knocked it against the wooden porch railing twice. There was a pause, then 3 knocks came back from the woods. I knocked 3 times in response. 4 knocks returned. This went on for maybe 5 minutes, this bizarre communication of knocks back and forth. Then, as the last light faded from the sky, I heard movement. Whatever was behind that tree was leaving, moving deeper into the woods. The branches swayed slightly, and then everything was still. I sat there in the dark for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like an understanding had been reached somehow. I can't explain it better than that. After that night, things changed. The aggressive activity, the rocks on the roof, the log throwing, it all stopped. We'd still hear them in the woods sometimes, still catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the property, still find the occasional footprint down by the creek, but it was different, less threatening. One morning in September, I went out early to check on a fence that needed repair on the far side of our property. As I approached the area, I found something placed carefully on top of a fence post, a dead rabbit. It wasn't mangled or eaten, just placed there, almost like an offering, a gift. I don't know. I left it there and went back to the house. That fall, the sightings and incidents gradually tapered off. By winter, things had quieted down completely. My dad said it was normal. They seemed to be less active in the colder months. Maybe they migrated. Maybe they just hunkered down somewhere. We didn't know. Over the next few years, the pattern continued. Increased activity in summer, quieter in winter. We learned to live with it. We respected their space, and they seemed to respect ours for the most part. We stayed on that property until 1990, when my dad got a job offer in Oregon and we had to move. Part of me was relieved to leave, but another part felt like we were abandoning something important, like we'd been part of something rare and significant that few people ever experience. I've never told this story publicly before. I don't have proof. No pictures, no hair samples. We left that tuft where we found it. Nothing that would convince a skeptic. But I know what I saw. I know what my family experienced over those years. Sometimes I wonder about those creatures, if they're still there in Pope Valley, living their mysterious lives, if they remember the family that shared their land for a while, if they're still throwing rocks on someone else's roof now. I still can't explain what happened that summer. I'm not sure I want to. Some things maybe aren't meant to be explained or captured or studied. Some things are just meant to be experienced and remembered and wondered about. All I know for sure is what I saw standing on that ridge that evening in 1987, and what I felt during those strange knocks exchanged in the growing darkness. Something intelligent, something wild, something that existed alongside us in a world we thought we understood, but clearly didn't. Story 2. I've never told this story to anyone except family and close friends because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened in the summer of 1974. I was 23 years old at the time, and my sister-in-law Rachel was 19. We were driving home from Long Pine, California, after visiting my brother, Rachel's husband, who was working there for the summer. Rachel and I were headed to see our grandmothers. Mine lived in Buttonwillow and hers in Porterville. So we decided to carpool and split the driving. We left Long Pine later than planned that day. Rachel had forgotten her overnight bag at the motel, so we had to go back for it, putting us behind schedule by almost an hour. The sun was already starting to set as we got on the road, and I remember feeling annoyed about having to drive in the dark. I didn't like night driving even back then, especially on those rural highways with no streetlights. I was behind the wheel of my dad's old Ford Galaxy, a boat of a car that he'd let me borrow for the trip. The radio was playing some Eagles song, and Rachel was half asleep in the passenger seat. We'd been on the road for about 3 hours, and I was getting tired but figured we'd stop in Paso Robles for coffee. It was fully dark by the time we passed through Paso Robles. The highway stretched out ahead of us, just this ribbon of black with my headlights cutting through it. We were on Highway 46, heading east toward Shandon, a stretch I'd driven dozens of times before without incident. About 5 miles outside of Paso Robles, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a coyote, or maybe a deer. Animals crossing the highway weren't uncommon in that area, especially at night. I tapped the brakes lightly, slowing down just in case it decided to bolt across the road. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer or a coyote. Whatever it was crouched down in the middle of my lane, and it wasn't moving. I hit the brakes harder, and the car skidded slightly. Rachel jerked awake next to me. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice groggy with sleep. I didn't answer because I couldn't process what I was seeing. There, illuminated in my headlights, was something I couldn't explain. It was crouched on its haunches in the road, about the size of a preteen kid. That's what I thought at first, that some kid was playing a dangerous prank. But as the car came to a stop about 20 feet away, I could see it wasn't a child at all. The thing, I still don't know what else to call it, was covered in dark brown hair, long and shaggy like a bear's, but it wasn't a bear. Its proportions were all wrong. It had arms that looked too long and a head that sat directly on its shoulders without much of a neck, and it was eating something. In the harsh glare of the headlights, I could make out a chicken. The creature was holding a chicken to its mouth, and there were feathers floating around it in the beam of light. "Oh my God!" Rachel whispered beside me. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the creature's head snapped up. I'll never forget those eyes catching the light. They reflected back yellowish, like a cat's or a dog's eyes do in photographs. For a moment, it just stared at us, and I stared back, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. Then it stood up. That's when my brain really short-circuited. Standing upright, it was taller than I'd first thought, maybe 4 feet tall. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and I could see its face more clearly now. The face wasn't covered in hair like the rest of its body. It had a flat, broad nose and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. I caught a glimpse of teeth, crooked and yellowed, as it let out a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a hiss. The whole encounter probably lasted only seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. Rachel was gripping my arm so hard it hurt, and I couldn't seem to make my foot move to the gas pedal. Then the creature moved. It darted to the left of our car with a speed that didn't seem possible for something its size. It was still clutching that chicken, feathers trailing behind it. It ran past the driver's side, and I twisted in my seat to follow its movement, catching sight of it again in my side mirror. The thing veered right behind our car and scrambled up the embankment on the side of the road. I noticed something else as it ran away. Its belly area wasn't covered in hair. There was a patch of skin visible, lighter colored, around what looked like a belly button. I remember thinking absurdly, it has a belly button. It's a boy. That detail has stuck with me all these years because it made the creature seem somehow more real, more biological. "What the hell was that?" Rachel's voice was high-pitched with fear. "I don't know," I said, but even as I said it, a possibility was forming in my mind. The hair, the proportions, the way it moved. It reminded me of stories I'd heard growing up in California, stories about Bigfoot. For a moment, I actually considered turning the car around to follow it. Not to catch it or anything crazy like that, just to confirm what we'd seen. My hand was on the gear shift, ready to put the car in reverse, when a chilling thought stopped me. If that was a juvenile Bigfoot, because it seemed too small to be an adult, then where were its parents? The thought of bigger versions of that creature, possibly lurking nearby, sent a wave of cold fear through me. I took my hand off the gear shift and pressed my foot firmly on the gas pedal instead. The tires squealed slightly as we accelerated away. "We need to tell someone," Rachel said, her face pale in the glow from the dashboard. "The police, or—" "And tell them what?" I cut her off. "That we saw a baby Bigfoot eating a chicken on Highway 46. They'd think we were drunk or high." Rachel fell silent, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. No one would believe us. We'd sound crazy. We drove in silence for several miles, both of us scanning the roadside nervously. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lumbering after us on the highway. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and my heart was still racing. "Maybe it was a bear cub," Rachel suggested after a while, but her tone said she didn't believe that any more than I did. "Bears don't stand and run on 2 legs like that," I said. "And they don't have almost hairless faces or belly buttons. Could it have been a person in a costume?" She tried again, "like some kid playing a prank." I shook my head. "No way. The movement was too fluid. And who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in a costume at night?" We tossed theories back and forth for the next hour as we continued driving, but nothing made sense. The more we talked about it, the more certain I became that we'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. I drove well over the speed limit the rest of the way to Buttonwillow, where we planned to stay at my grandmother's house for the night. Every time we passed a dark patch of trees or an area where the highway narrowed, I tensed up, scanning for any movement. The night seemed different now, more menacing somehow. When we finally pulled into my grandmother's driveway around midnight, I was exhausted from the combination of driving and adrenaline. My grandmother was already asleep, so we let ourselves in quietly and collapsed in the guest room, both too wired to actually sleep, despite our exhaustion. "Sarah," Rachel whispered in the darkness, "what do you think it was doing with that chicken?" I didn't want to state the obvious, that it was eating it, because that led to other questions about where it got the chicken and whether it had killed it and what else it might hunt or eat. Instead, I just said, "I don't know. Let's try to get some sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, that flat nose, those reflective eyes, those crooked teeth. I kept hearing that grunt hiss sound it made. The next morning over breakfast, we told my grandmother what we'd seen. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her expression unreadable. When we finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Your grandfather used to talk about strange things in those hills," she finally said. "He worked the oil fields near Shandon back in the 30s. He and the other men would sometimes find footprints too big to be human, or hear weird howling at night. The old-timers called them wild men of the woods. No one ever saw one up close, though." She told us a few more stories she'd heard over the years. Hikers gone missing, hunters finding deer carcasses stripped clean in impossible places, strange screams in the night that weren't coyotes or mountain lions. Nothing concrete, just local legends and whispers. "You girls were lucky," she said as she cleared away the breakfast dishes. "Whatever you saw was more scared of you than you were of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have run away." I'm not sure if she really believed us or was just humoring us, but it was comforting to think that maybe we weren't completely crazy, that maybe there was something to what we'd seen. Rachel left for Porterville later that day to visit her own grandmother. Before she left, we agreed not to tell anyone else about what happened. Who would believe us anyway? Over the years, we've occasionally brought it up when we see each other at family gatherings, but we don't talk about it much anymore. It's like this weird shared secret we have. I've driven that stretch of Highway 46 many times since then, always in daylight, always scanning the roadside more carefully than I probably should. I've never seen anything like that creature again, though sometimes, when I'm on that highway as the sun is starting to set, I get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched from the hills. I've read articles about Bigfoot sightings in California over the years. Some of the descriptions match what we saw: the shaggy hair, the proportions, the way it moved. But most reported sightings are of adult creatures, much taller than the one we encountered. I've never read about anyone else seeing what seemed like a juvenile. I wonder sometimes what happened to that creature. Did it grow up? Are there more of them out there? Was it truly a young Bigfoot or something else entirely that science hasn't classified? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. It's been almost 50 years since that night, and I still can't explain what we saw. Rachel passed away 2 years ago, so I'm the only one left who remembers it firsthand. I guess that's why I'm finally sharing this story here. I'm 73 now, and I don't want this experience to die with me. I know how it sounds. I know most people will think I'm making this up, or that my memory has twisted something ordinary into something extraordinary over time. But I know what I saw. That creature on Highway 46 was real. It was eating a chicken in the middle of the road. It looked at us with intelligent eyes, and then it ran away on 2 legs up an embankment and disappeared into the California night. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still see those eyes reflecting in my headlights, and I wonder if somewhere out in those hills between Paso Robles and Shandon, that creature, now fully grown, remembers the night it encountered two terrified women in a Ford Galaxy and decided to run away instead of coming closer. Story 3. I never believed in Bigfoot. Not once in my 42 years had I given any serious thought to those stories. Whenever the topic came up, I'd laugh it off as nonsense for gullible people who watch too many documentaries on the History Channel. That was before October 25th, 2010. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. I live in a rural area about 2 hours north of San Francisco. My property sits on 3 acres, backing up to forest land. It's quiet out here, the kind of quiet city people can't comprehend. When something breaks that silence, you notice. That night, I was up late watching a rerun of Deadliest Catch. Must have been around 1 a.m. My 2 dogs, Rex and Daisy, were crashed out on the floor beside me. Nothing unusual, just a normal Monday night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was a siren in the distance. We get emergency vehicles passing sometimes, though not often out here. I grabbed the remote and muted the TV. That's when I realized this was no siren. The sound started like a horn, a long, low blowing sound. But then it changed. It morphed into something I can only describe as a cry. Not human, definitely not an animal I recognized. It was like a moan of pain, but deeper, more guttural, and so loud it carried through the trees. It made the hair on my arms stand up. What really freaked me out was how Rex and Daisy reacted. These are farm dogs. They've chased off bears, fought with coyotes, and generally fear nothing. But when that sound came, both of them jumped up, their ears pulled back. Rex started whimpering, and Daisy pressed herself against my legs. When I tried to let them out to investigate, something I'd done hundreds of times when we heard strange noises, they flat out refused. Rex actually ran to the bathroom and hid behind the toilet. I didn't sleep well that night, kept thinking about that sound. I've lived in these woods for 15 years and have heard everything from mountain lions to a cow giving birth. This was different. The next day, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just some weird combination of sounds, wind through the trees, a distant vehicle, my tired brain filling in the gaps. By evening, I'd mostly pushed it aside. My buddy Mike called about going to the casino up in Clear Lake. We do this maybe once a month. Drive up, play some blackjack, have a few beers, normal guy stuff. I figured it would be a good distraction. Mike picked me up around 8 p.m. in his F-150. It was already dark out, which happens early in October. We were about 20 minutes into the drive on that stretch of back road that cuts through the state forest. Not much out there, no streetlights, no houses, just trees and the occasional turnout for hikers. We were bullshitting about the 49ers' chances this season when it happened again. That same sound from the night before. Only now it was closer, much closer. "What the hell is that?" Mike asked, slowing the truck. "You hear it too?" I was almost relieved I wasn't the only one. "Of course I hear it. Sounds like something dying." Mike pulled over to the shoulder and we rolled down the windows to listen better. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing around so it was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. Then it stopped abruptly. "Weird," Mike said, putting the truck back in drive. "Mountain lion, maybe?" I've heard mountain lions. That wasn't it. We continued driving, both of us a little on edge now. The road curved sharply about a half-mile ahead, with dense forest on both sides. As we rounded that bend, Mike had to slam on the brakes. Standing at the edge of the road, partially illuminated by our headlights, was something. Something that shouldn't exist. I've replayed this moment in my head thousands of times since then. I've questioned what I saw, tried to rationalize it, but I know what was there. It was tall, impossibly tall. if I had to guess, at least 10 feet. It was covered in dark hair, either black or very dark brown, hard to tell in the headlights. The thing that haunts me most were the eyes. When our lights hit them, they reflected back with this intense yellow-green glow. Human eyes don't do that. Dog eyes, cat eyes, deer eyes. They all reflect light. But this was different. Brighter, more aware. The creature froze for a second, staring directly at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly, just the general shape of a head, those glowing eyes, and what might have been a heavy brow. Its arms hung long at its sides, well past where a human's would end. Neither Mike nor I spoke. What do you say when you're looking at something that can't possibly exist? My mouth went completely dry. I felt cold all over, despite the heater being on full blast. Then it moved, not away from us like you'd expect from a startled animal, but parallel to the road, in these long, fluid strides that ate up ground faster than a person could run. 3 or 4 steps, and it disappeared into the tree line. The whole encounter lasted maybe 6 seconds. 6 seconds that changed how I see the world. Did you fucking see that? Mike's voice cracked. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Yeah, was all I could manage. We sat there for maybe 30 seconds before a car behind us honked. Looking in the side mirror, I could see it was a blue sedan. They must have pulled up while we were gawking at whatever we'd just seen. The driver flashed their lights, signaling for us to move. As Mike eased the truck forward, I noticed the sedan had also slowed dramatically. They stayed well back from us for the next few miles, as if they were nervous too. Makes me think they saw it as well. Neither of us mentioned what happened for the next 10 miles. It was like we both needed time to process it. Finally, at a gas station where we stopped for beer, Mike turned to me. That was a bear, right? Had to be. I almost agreed with him. Almost let us both have the comfortable lie. But I couldn't. Bears don't stand like that, Mike. They don't have that shape. Well, it wasn't a goddamn Bigfoot. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. What if it was? Don't start with that shit, Tom. We've been friends too long for you to go crazy on me. We still went to the casino as planned, played cards and drank beers like nothing happened. But it was hollow, just going through the motions. My mind kept replaying those 6 seconds. The height, the fluid movement, those eyes. On the drive back, we took the main highway. It was 40 minutes longer, but neither of us suggested the back road. We also didn't talk about what we'd seen. It hung between us like some unspoken pact. Acknowledge it, and it becomes real. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went to my computer. I spent hours researching Bigfoot sightings in Northern California. There were dozens, some within 20 miles of my property. People described the same things: the height, the stride, the eyes. One account from 1976 mentioned a mournful howling that the witness heard 3 nights in a row before spotting the creature. I found myself going down a rabbit hole of research: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, different names for potentially the same thing. Native American tribes in this region have centuries of stories about wild men of the woods. Thousands of sightings across North America, many by credible witnesses, police officers, park rangers, military personnel. The more I read, the more I became convinced what we saw couldn't have been human. No man is that tall, moves that way, has eyes that reflect light like that. It wasn't a bear either. The proportions were all wrong, and bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs for that distance. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed. I installed game cameras around my property. I started keeping a digital recorder by my bed in case I heard that sound again. I even bought a better flashlight, one of those tactical ones that can light up something 100 yards away. Mike and I have only talked about it once since that night. He called me about a month later, drunk. I looked it up, he said without preamble when I answered. Looked what up? The eye thing, the glowing. Humans don't have a tapetum lucidum. A what? It's the reflective layer in animals' eyes. Cats, dogs, deer, they all have it. It's why their eyes glow in photos. Humans don't have that. There was a long pause before he continued. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't a person in a costume. He hung up after that, and we've never discussed it again. We still meet up for beers, still go to the casino sometimes, but we take the highway now, always. It's been nearly 13 years since that night, and I still don't know what to make of it. I didn't become some hardcore Bigfoot hunter or join any cryptid searching groups, but I can't dismiss it either. I've told this story exactly 3 times. Once to my brother, who thought I was pulling his leg. Once to a girl I was dating, who seemed more concerned about my mental health than anything else. And once to a forest ranger who just nodded silently, then told me about similar reports from hikers in the area. I still live in the same house, still have those game cameras up, though they've never caught anything stranger than a mountain lion. I've never heard that sound again, though sometimes when I'm out on my porch at night, I find myself listening for it. I don't know if what we saw was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. I just know it was something that shouldn't exist according to science, something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the world. And that's perhaps the scariest part, not the creature itself, but what its existence implies about all the other things we dismiss as myths or legends. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I drive out to that stretch of road. I never get out of my car. I just sit there with the engine running, windows up, and wonder if it's out there, watching from the tree line with those glowing eyes. I doubt I'll ever know for sure. But every time I hear about another sighting or see one of those blurry photos online, I don't laugh anymore, because I know what I saw that night. And no matter how much I try to rationalize it away, I know it saw me too. Story 4. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. For years, I've tried to convince myself that what I saw that day was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and it's haunted me ever since. This happened back in 1978, when I was about 9 years old. My family lived in this small house by a levee in rural California, about 20 miles outside of Sacramento. It wasn't much. 3 bedrooms, peeling paint, drafty windows, but it was home. My dad worked at a factory in the city, and my mom stayed home with me and my younger sister. Behind our property was this big levee that separated our land from the river. On the other side, there was this small camp where immigrant workers stayed, mostly guys from Mexico who came up for seasonal work on the surrounding farms. My parents were friendly with them, especially my mum, who spoke a little Spanish from her own family. It was early spring when a couple of the workers came over and asked if they could borrow my mom's rifle. She had this old .22 that her father had given her years ago. She wasn't much of a hunter, but she kept it around for protection since we lived so far out. The men explained they wanted to hunt rabbits to supplement their meals. Food was tight for them, and rabbit stew would be a welcome change from beans and tortillas. My mom agreed, and for the next few weeks they'd come by every Saturday morning to borrow the rifle, returning it by sundown. They were always respectful, and sometimes they'd bring us a rabbit as a thank you. They had set up this wooden rack near their camp where they'd hang the rabbits before cleaning them. I remember watching them from a distance, fascinated but grossed out at the same time, as they skinned them and prepared the meat. About 3 weeks into this arrangement, something strange started happening. Rabbits began disappearing from the rack. At first, the workers thought maybe it was coyotes or some other animal, but then more went missing, and tensions started rising. I overheard one of the men talking to my mom, basically hinting that maybe someone from our family was taking them. My mom was offended and told them we had no need to steal their rabbits. The accusations put a strain on the relationship. My mom still let them borrow the rifle, but the friendly atmosphere had changed. I could tell she was upset about it, though she tried not to show it around me and my sister. One Saturday in April, I remember it was warm but not hot yet. I was bored out of my mind. My sister was at a friend's house, my dad was working an extra shift, and my mom was busy with chores. I kept pestering her to play with me or take me somewhere, but she was in no mood. Finally, she snapped a bit and told me to go outside and find something to do. I wandered around our yard for a while, throwing rocks at an old can, but then my eyes kept drifting toward the levee. We weren't supposed to go over it without permission. My mom had these vague warnings about dangerous currents in the river and not bothering the workers. But the levee itself seemed harmless enough, and I figured I could at least climb up and look around without going all the way to the other side. "Just stay in the yard, Michael," my mom had said before I headed out. But the yard felt so small that day, and the levee was calling to me like some forbidden adventure. I waited until my mom was in the back of the house doing laundry, then made my way to the base of the levee. It wasn't super steep, but it was tall enough that you couldn't see over it until you were at the top. I scrambled up, my sneakers slipping a bit on the dry grass. When I reached the top, I sat down and looked out over the other side. The view was pretty cool from up there. I could see the river glittering in the afternoon sun, the workers' camp with its collection of tents and a couple of small structures, and beyond that, fields stretching toward distant trees. The men were mostly gone that day, probably working or in town. Only a couple remained, sitting in the shade too far away to notice me. I was about to head back down when something caught my eye. There was a movement in a large cottonwood tree that stood maybe 50 yards from the levee, closer to the river. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying in the breeze, but there wasn't much wind that day. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. That's when I saw it. In the upper branches of the tree, partially hidden in the shade, was something big. My first thought was that it was a person, maybe one of the workers climbing the tree for some reason, but this was much larger than any man I'd ever seen. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slid down the other side of the levee, moving closer to get a better look. As I approached, staying low in the tall grass, I could make out more details, and my blood ran cold. It was some kind of creature sitting on a thick branch about 20 feet up. One leg, I guess you'd call it a leg, was dangling below the branch, swinging slightly. It was covered in dark hair or fur, a brownish-black color that blended with the shadows. From what I could see, it had to be at least 7 feet tall if it were standing. I froze, crouching in the grass, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear me. The creature shifted slightly, reaching for something with long, powerful arms. That's when I realized it was holding something, tearing at it. With a sickening feeling, I recognized the floppy ears and hind legs of a rabbit. My mouth went dry as I tried to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. We didn't have bears around there anyway. It wasn't any animal I recognized from books or TV. It looked like some kind of ape or monkey, but massive. But what would something like that be doing in California? I must have made some small sound, or maybe it just sensed me watching, because suddenly the creature went still. Then, slowly, it turned its head in my direction. I'll never forget what I saw. Its face wasn't fully ape-like. The proportions were wrong. The head seemed smaller compared to its body than a gorilla's would be. The face was dark with a pronounced brow, but there was something almost human in its eyes. Those eyes, they were dark and intelligent, and they were looking right at me. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. Then the creature made a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, and shifted its position on the branch. That broke the spell. Pure terror shot through me, and I scrambled backward, nearly falling. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I clawed my way up the levee, slipping and scraping my knees, but barely feeling it through the adrenaline. I half ran, half fell down the other side, and sprinted all the way to our house, certain the whole time that massive hands were about to grab me from behind. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut and locking it. My mum came running from the laundry room, her face alarmed. "Michael, what on earth?" "There's a monster!" I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "By the river, in the tree, a huge monkey or something." My mum's expression changed from anger to concern. She put her hands on my shoulders. "Slow down. What did you see exactly?" Through gulps of air and tears I hadn't even realized were streaming down my face, I described what I'd seen. The massive, hairy creature in the tree, the way it had been eating a rabbit, the human-like eyes that had stared right at me. I expected her to tell me I was imagining things or had seen a large raccoon or something, but she didn't. Her face went pale, and she glanced toward the window. Without a word, she walked through the house, checking that all the doors and windows were locked. When she came back, she knelt in front of me. "Listen to me carefully, Michael. I want you to stay in the house. Don't go outside until your father gets home. Understand?" I nodded, still shaking. "And I don't want you going near that levee again, ever. Promise me." "I promise," I whispered. Later that evening, when my dad got home, I heard them talking in low voices in the kitchen. I crept down the hallway to listen. "Taking the rabbits," my mum was saying. "It has to be." "Come on, Sarah," my dad said. "The boy probably saw a big raccoon or maybe even a mountain lion. They can climb trees." "You didn't see his face, Tom. He was terrified. And it explains the missing rabbits. So what are you saying? That there's some kind of, a Bigfoot living by the river? That's crazy talk." "I don't know what it is," my mum replied, "but I know my son. He saw something." My dad must have noticed me then, because he called me into the kitchen. He tried to be reassuring, suggesting all sorts of normal animals I might have mistaken for something more sinister. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or a man in a coat. It was something else entirely. The next day, my dad went to talk to the workers about the missing rabbits, carefully avoiding any mention of my monster. One of the older men, Manuel, got a strange look on his face when my dad brought up the thefts. "We have stories," he said in his accented English, "in my village, about a creature in the mountains that takes animals. Sometimes people. El Mono Grande, we call it. The Great Monkey." My dad laughed it off, but Manuel didn't join in. He just made the sign of the cross and muttered something in Spanish. After that day, my parents never let me or my sister play near the levee. The workers stopped borrowing the rifle too, though I never found out if that was their decision or my mom's. The rabbit thefts continued for another week or so, and then stopped suddenly. A couple of months later, something else happened that made us forget all about my encounter. A series of murders occurred at one of the nearby farms. 3 workers were found dead in their bunks, their throats torn out. The police said it was likely an animal attack, possibly a rabid wolf or coyote that had somehow gotten into their sleeping quarters. But no animal was ever found. My parents decided it was time to move. We left that fall, relocating to a suburb closer to my dad's work. As the years passed, we rarely spoke of what had happened by the levee. My mum would sometimes give me a certain look if we were camping or hiking in a wooded area. A silent reminder to be careful, to be aware. I'm 54 now with kids of my own. I've never told them about what I saw that day. What would be the point? They'd either think I was making it up or get unnecessarily scared of the woods. But I've never forgotten that creature in the tree, those intelligent eyes staring into mine. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, watched documentaries about unexplained creatures, and wondered if that's what I encountered. But none of the descriptions quite match what I saw. Whatever it was, I know it was real. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, or even just in my backyard at dusk, I get this prickling feeling on the back of my neck. Like something's watching me from the shadows, something that doesn't belong in our world, but exists in it anyway, hiding just out of sight. I still can't look at a rabbit without remembering that day, and I still can't bring myself to climb up on levees or explore certain wooded areas. Some fears never leave you, no matter how many decades pass. Some memories stay as fresh as the day they were made. And sometimes I wonder, is it still out there, that huge monkey by the levee? And what else might be hiding in the wilderness just beyond our sight? Story 5. I still get a cold feeling in my gut when I think about that night in '99. I've kept this inside for so long that it feels strange to finally type it out. Maybe someone here has seen what I saw, but I doubt it. God, I hope no one else has had to experience that. It was mid-December, 1999. I was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Phoenix in my Peterbilt. Not the newest rig on the road, but she was reliable. I'd been driving that route for 7 years by then, knew every curve and dip in the highway. I was on my way back from a delivery in Blythe, California, empty trailer, looking forward to getting home to my wife Maria and our 2 kids in Glendale. The night was cold, desert cold, which cuts right through you once the sun goes down. Must have been around 10 p.m. when I hit that stretch of mountain highway between Blythe and Quartzsite. You know the one, where the road winds through those dark hills, not much around except scrub brush and rocks. No streetlights, just your high beams cutting through pitch black. I'd been pushing fluids all day to stay alert. 2 thermoses of coffee and a couple bottles of water. My bladder was about to burst, and there wasn't a rest stop for another 40 miles. I spotted a wide pullout on the right side of the highway. No other cars around, no lights visible in any direction, just me, my rig, and miles of empty desert. I pulled over, cut the engine, but left the headlights on. Force of habit. You always want to see what's around you when you're stopped on a dark highway. The dashboard clock read 10:17 p.m. I remember that clearly, because later I wished I'd just held it another 40 minutes to the next proper rest area. I hopped down from the cab, stretched my legs for a second, and walked around to the passenger side of the truck. More privacy that way, off the road. The night was dead quiet, except for the occasional pinging of my cooling engine. You know how it gets in the desert at night, so silent you can hear your own heartbeat. That's when I first noticed the smell. At first I thought maybe a skunk had been hit on the road, but it was different, stronger, like roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, mixed with something else I couldn't place, something musky and wild. It hit me so strong I actually gagged a little. I covered my nose with my sleeve and figured I'd finish up quick and get back on the road. I was just zipping up when I heard it, the sound of rocks tumbling down the mountainside maybe 30 yards ahead of my truck. In the desert, sounds carry. It wasn't a small animal. The rocks were big enough to make substantial noise as they rolled down. My first thought was mountain lion. They're in those hills and they're nothing to mess with. I turned to look up the slope, squinting past my headlights into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. Something was moving down the hillside. At first, I could just make out a large shape, grayish-brown against the darker background of the mountain. I froze in place, one hand still on my zipper, watching as this thing moved down toward the road about 20 yards in front of my truck. It was huge. Not like bear huge, I've seen bears. This was different. It stood upright on 2 legs, walking almost like a man, but with a weird, rolling gait. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The headlights caught it as it reached the edge of the road, and I got a clear look at it for maybe 3 seconds before my brain started screaming at me to move. Its body was covered in long, matted hair, not fur like an animal, but hair, grayish-brown and hanging in dirty clumps. The frame underneath was massive. Wide shoulders, long arms that hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, thank God. Just a dark area where a face should be, partially hidden by the hair. As it stepped onto the asphalt, it made this sound, not a growl or a roar, but a grunt, like deep, guttural, coming from something with lungs bigger than mine. That sound. Jesus, that sound is what still wakes me up at night sometimes. The stench intensified as it moved, so strong I thought I might throw up. It was like death and wet animal and something else, something I can't describe, but that felt ancient and wrong. My eyes were watering from it. It walked right through my headlight beams, moving with purpose like it was heading somewhere specific. Not running, not particularly bothered by the lights or my presence, just walking across the highway like it had every right to be there. In those few seconds, I felt something I've never felt before or since. Pure animal fear. Not the kind of fear you get when someone pulls a gun or when you nearly crash your truck. This was deeper, more primal. Every cell in my body was screaming, danger, run, hide. I felt like a mouse that just spotted a hawk's shadow. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was frozen by my truck, the next I was scrambling back into the cab, hands shaking so bad I could barely grab the door handle. I didn't look to see where it went after it crossed the road. I didn't want to know. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, found them again. Started the engine on the second try. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I pulled back onto the highway without even checking for traffic, floored it, and didn't slow down until I hit the outskirts of Quartzsite, almost 30 miles away. The whole time I was driving, I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that thing was somehow following me. The smell had gotten into my clothes, my hair. I could still smell it hours later when I finally got home, even after I'd rolled all the windows down to air out the cab. I got home around 2 a.m. Maria was asleep. I stripped off my clothes in the garage and stuffed them in a trash bag, then took the longest shower of my life. I told her I'd hit a skunk when she asked about the smell the next morning. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep right. Kept jerking awake, thinking I heard that grunt outside our bedroom window. I'd get up and check the locks 3-4 times a night. Started drinking more than I should have just to calm my nerves enough to sleep. I never told anyone what I saw. Not Maria, not my buddies at work, nobody. What was I going to say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot on Highway 95. They'd think I was nuts or on drugs or both. Truckers already get enough crap about highway hypnosis and seeing things that aren't there after too many hours on the road. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume either. Nothing human moves like that or makes that sound. Whatever it was real, and it was alive, and it didn't belong in this world as I understand it. I never drove that stretch of highway at night again. Would add 2 hours to my route just to avoid it after dark. Eventually switched to local routes so I could sleep in my own bed every night. Told everyone it was to spend more time with the family as the kids got older. That was partly true, but mostly I just couldn't stand being out there in the dark anymore, wondering what else might be watching from the hills. It's been over 20 years now. I'm retired, grandkids visiting on weekends. Life is good, but I still think about that night. Still wonder what would have happened if I'd been outside my truck when that thing crossed the road. If it would have kept walking, or if it would have turned toward me. I looked into it later, real quiet-like. Found out that area has had reports of strange sightings going back to the 70s. Hikers gone missing. Cattle mutilations that nobody could explain. Local Native American legends about wild men in the mountains that go back centuries. I respect those mountains now. Respect what might be hiding in them. I don't hike, don't camp, don't go anywhere I can't see clear sight lines in all directions. My boys think I'm just being an old paranoid man when I warn them about going into wilderness areas. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw that night. It was real. It was massive. And it didn't give a damn about me or my truck or my headlights. It was just passing through, going about its business in what it probably considers its territory. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was watching, if it smelled me like I smelled it, if it could have, I don't know, done something to me if it wanted to. I think about how easily it could have changed direction, come toward my truck instead of crossing the road. I don't have any proof, no photos. No footprints, nothing but my memory, which gets a little hazier each year. But that grunt, that smell, those don't fade. Those are burned into my brain forever. I'm only writing this now because my doctor says I should get it out, stop keeping it bottled up. Says it might help with the nightmares I still get sometimes. I doubt it, but here we are. People can believe me or not, doesn't matter. I know what I saw, and I know there are things in this world that we're not supposed to see, things that exist in the spaces between towns, in the dark places we just passed through. Things that were here long before us and will be here long after. If you're driving through those mountains at night and need to make a stop, my advice is simple. Hold it till the next rest area. Whatever miles you have to drive, whatever discomfort you have to endure, it's better than what might be waiting in the dark, just off the edge of your headlights. Story 6. I've never been the type of person who believes in cryptids or monsters or anything like that. Growing up, I was always the kid who wanted facts, evidence, something solid I could see with my own eyes. But what happened back in '98 changed everything for me, and I still can't explain it to this day. It was late June of 1998, just after graduation. I was 18, and a bunch of us from Livermore High had been planning this trip for weeks. Me, Jeremy, my best friend Mike, who was driving the first car, Ryan, who drove the second car, and 4 others, Steph, Dave, Chris, and Amber. We were all going out to find this abandoned mental hospital that supposedly existed somewhere in the hills outside of town. We'd tried to find it twice before, once during the day when we chickened out because we thought we saw a security guard, and another time at night when we got completely lost and ended up at some random farm. This time, though, we had better directions. Chris's older brother had actually been there, and he'd drawn us this crude map on the back of a jack-in-the-box napkin. Looking back now, that should have been our first clue that this wasn't exactly a well-thought-out expedition. It was around 9:30 p.m. when we left Mike's house. The sky was clear, with that deep blue color it gets right after sunset, and there was a slight breeze. Perfect California summer weather. We took 2 cars, mainly because none of us had vehicles big enough to fit everyone. Mike, Steph, Dave and me in one car, and Ryan, Chris and Amber in the other. We drove out past the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the roads got narrower and more winding. The whole time, we were blasting corn from the CD player and joking about what we might find at the hospital. Urban legends, you know? Stories about ghost patients, mad doctors, the usual stuff teenagers talk about to freak each other out. We drove for maybe 40 minutes, following this rural road that went past Lawrence Livermore Lab and out toward the reservoir. The road got worse the further we went. Fewer houses, more potholes, trees crowding in from both sides. It was the kind of place where your cell phone definitely wouldn't work, not that many of us even had them back then. Eventually, we reached what we thought was the turn-off point, according to Chris's brother's napkin map. There was a small gravel area near what looked like some kind of water pumping station for the reservoir. Mike pulled over and Ryan pulled in behind us. I remember checking my watch. It was about 10:20 p.m. by then. The night had fully set in, and out there, away from the city lights, it was seriously dark, like can't see your hand in front of your face dark. We'd all brought flashlights, of course, because we weren't complete idiots, just partial ones. Ryan and I got out of our cars first. I'm not sure why, but I think we were both just stretching our legs after the drive, while the others were still getting their stuff together. I remember the sound of crickets being almost deafening, and somewhere in the distance I could hear an owl. I clicked on my flashlight, one of those heavy black mag lights that were popular back then, and turned toward the hillside behind us. According to the napkin map, we needed to hike up about half a mile to find the access road that led to the hospital ruins. That's when I saw it. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. My flashlight beam caught something moving along the base of the hill, maybe 40 feet away from where Ryan and I were standing. It was tall. I mean really tall, like at least 7 feet, and covered in what looked like dark brown fur. It was walking on 2 legs, moving from left to right across my field of vision. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, flashlight trained on this thing, as it walked with this strange, fluid gait that was both human-like and not. Its arms were long, swinging slightly at its sides, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders without much of a neck. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, I managed to whisper, "Ryan, are you seeing this?" I didn't turn to look at him, couldn't take my eyes off the creature, but I heard him make this strangled noise of confirmation. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered back. We watched, completely frozen, as the creature continued to move to the right, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by our presence. Then it turned slightly and started moving up the hillside. Its movements were deliberate, powerful. It definitely wasn't struggling with the incline, and then, just like that, it disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking, making the flashlight beam dance erratically across the hillside. Ryan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "Did we just... was that..." "I don't know," I said, but I did know. We both did. What we'd just seen wasn't a person, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could rationally explain. The others were getting out of the cars now, laughing about something, completely unaware. Ryan and I looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both seemed to come to the same conclusion. Don't tell them. At least not yet. They'd either think we were pranking them, or they'd freak out and want to leave, and despite what we'd just seen, or maybe because of it, I still wanted to go up that hill. "You guys ready?" Mike called out, slinging a backpack over his shoulder. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Let's go." We all clicked on our flashlights and started up the hill. The plan was to follow a small trail that supposedly led to an old service road, which would then take us to the hospital ruins. But as we walked, I found myself unable to focus on the path ahead. Instead, I kept scanning the darkness behind us, beside us, above us. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made me jump. I've never been afraid of the dark. Even as a kid, I was always the one volunteering to go down to the basement or out to the garage at night. But this was different. This was a primal kind of fear, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up and your skin prickle with goosebumps. Ryan was acting the same way. He kept close to me, both of us bringing up the rear of our little group. Every few minutes we'd exchange glances, silently confirming that yes, we had both seen the same thing, and yes, we were both freaking the hell out. We'd been hiking for maybe 15 minutes when Steph noticed something was off. She turned back to look at Ryan and me, her flashlight briefly catching our faces. "What's wrong with you two?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Everyone stopped and turned to look at us. I glanced at Ryan, and he gave me this slight nod. We saw something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Down by the cars before you all got out." "What kind of something?" Dave asked, an edge of skepticism already in his voice. I took a deep breath. It was big, like really big, walking on 2 legs across the bottom of the hill. "It had fur," Ryan added, "dark brown, and it moved weird, not like a person." There was a moment of silence, and then Chris burst out laughing. "You're shitting us, right? What, like a Bigfoot or something?" I didn't answer, which only made him laugh harder. "Come on, guys," Amber said, looking nervously around. "That's not funny." "We're not joking," Ryan insisted. "We both saw it. It was right there, clear as day in the flashlight beam." Mike, who had known me since we were kids, studied my face. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded. "I know how it sounds, but yeah, dead serious." Dave shook his head. "It was probably just a bear." They can stand on their back legs, you know." "It wasn't standing," I said firmly. "It was walking the whole time, all the way across. No bear walks on its hind legs like that." "And it was too tall," Ryan added. "Way too tall for a bear." There was another uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I could tell none of them really believed us, not completely. But there was enough doubt, enough of that what-if feeling, that the atmosphere had changed. The fun adventure vibe was gone, replaced by a tense wariness. "So what do you want to do?" Mike finally asked. "Head back?" Part of me wanted to say yes, to run back to the cars, drive home and pretend none of this had happened. But another part, the part that had always needed to see things with my own eyes, wanted to keep going. "Let's keep going," I said, "but stay together and keep your flashlights on." We continued up the hill, but the easy conversation and laughter from earlier were gone. Now we moved in a tight group, our flashlight beams crisscrossing the path ahead and to the sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every dark space between the trees seemed to hide something waiting. About halfway up the hill, we found the old service road. It was overgrown, barely visible, but definitely man-made. We turned onto it, following its gradual curve around the hillside. That's when we heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself, followed by a high-pitched whining noise that made my teeth hurt. It came from somewhere up ahead, around the bend in the road. We all froze. Even Chris wasn't laughing anymore. "What the hell was that?" Amber whispered, her voice shaking. No one answered. No one had to. Whatever had made that sound, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal native to the California hills that I knew of. "We should go back," Steph said, already starting to back up. "Right now." For once, I didn't argue. Neither did anyone else. As one, we turned and started quickly heading back down the way we'd come. We weren't running, not yet, but we were moving a lot faster than we had on the way up. That's when we heard the sound again, but this time it was behind us. Whatever had been ahead of us had somehow circled around. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It was between us and the cars. "Run," Mike said, and this time no one needed convincing. We ran down that hill like our lives depended on it, flashlight beams bouncing wildly, illuminating fragments of the path, the trees, each other's terrified faces. I remember the sound of our breathing, harsh and panicked, and the thudding of our feet on the dirt. I was near the back of the group again, with only Ryan behind me. I could hear him panting, the beam of his flashlight swinging wildly, and then I heard him stumble, a quick intake of breath followed by the sound of him hitting the ground. I skidded to a stop and turned back. "Ryan!" He was on his hands and knees, his flashlight rolling away down the slope. I grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet. "I'm okay," he gasped, "just tripped." I retrieved his flashlight and handed it back to him. As he took it, I noticed his hand was bleeding. He must have cut it on a rock when he fell. We started running again, trying to catch up with the others who hadn't noticed we'd stopped. Their flashlight beams were already far ahead, bouncing away down the hill. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, fast footsteps coming through the trees to our right, not from the direction of our friends, from something else. "Go!" I shouted at Ryan, pushing him ahead of me. "Go!" We ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The footsteps kept pace, moving parallel to us through the trees. I didn't look, I didn't dare look, but I could feel it there, just out of sight, running alongside us. Somehow, we made it to the bottom of the hill. The others were already at the cars, shouting for us to hurry. We burst out of the tree line and sprinted across the open ground toward the parking area. As we reached the cars, I finally turned to look back at the hillside, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow, but unmistakably there. Tall, massive, the same creature Ryan and I had seen earlier. For a moment, it just stood there watching us. Then it made that sound again, that impossible growl whine that seemed to vibrate my very bones. In the dim light reflected from our flashlights, I could see its outline clearly enough to know this was no bear, no person in a costume. This was something else entirely. "Get in the car!" Mike was shouting, already behind the wheel with the engine running. I dragged my eyes away from the creature and dove into the back seat. Ryan jumped into his own car. Doors slammed, engines revved, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying from beneath the tires. In the rearview mirror, I watched the pumping station and the hillside recede into darkness. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the drone of the engine as Mike drove way too fast down that rural road. Finally, when we were back on the main highway heading toward town, Steph broke the silence. "What the hell was that thing?" No one answered. No one had to. We all knew what Ryan and I had claimed to see. And now I was pretty sure they'd all caught at least a glimpse of it too. "Bigfoot," I said quietly. "We saw a Bigfoot." Dave made a sound that might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's not possible. Bigfoot isn't real." "Then what did we see?" I challenged. "What made that sound? What was following us?" He had no answer. When we got back to Mike's house, Ryan and the others in his car were already there. We sat in Mike's garage with the door closed, drinking warm sodas and trying to make sense of what had happened. Everyone had a different take. Chris insisted it must have been some kind of prank, maybe college kids trying to scare us. Amber thought it might have been a homeless person living in the hills. Dave still thought it was a bear, despite all evidence to the contrary. But Ryan and I knew what we'd seen. And deep down, I think the others knew too. They just couldn't admit it, couldn't allow themselves to believe that something like that could exist so close to home, just outside our normal everyday lives. We made a pact that night, not to tell anyone else what had happened. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, but we also promised never to go back to that hillside, never to search for that hospital again. It's been over 20 years now since that night. I've never gone back to that spot, never tried to find that hospital again. I've read all the articles, all the scientific papers debunking Bigfoot sightings. I've seen all the TV shows with their grainy footage and questionable evidence, and I get it. I understand why people don't believe, but I know what I saw that night. I know what followed us down that hill, and no amount of rational explanation can erase the memory of that creature standing at the edge of the trees, watching us flee. I still live in California, though not in Livermore anymore. Sometimes when I'm driving on a rural road at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, watching for movement. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see something tall and dark moving just beyond the reach of my headlights. And then I drive a little faster, and I don't look back. Story 7. I'm not sure why I'm writing this out after all these years. Maybe it's because I still think about it almost daily, even though it happened back in '82. I was 26 then, a high school biology teacher with a comfortable life and rational explanations for just about everything. That was before the camping trip that changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was spring break, late April 1982. I'd convinced my younger brother Matt, he was 19, and 2 of my buddies from college, Steve and Jim, to go on a hiking and fishing expedition to the Mariana River area in Northern California. It's a beautiful remote spot that I'd heard about from another teacher at my school who was big into wilderness adventures. None of us were exactly outdoorsmen, but we were all in decent shape and thought it sounded like a great adventure. We packed enough supplies for a 4-day trip: tents, sleeping bags, fishing gear, food, the works. I remember being excited about getting away from the classroom and spending some quality time with my brother and friends. We drove about 3 hours from Sacramento, parked at this tiny ranger station, and headed out on the trail around 8 a.m. The plan was to hike deep into the backcountry and find a good spot by the river to set up camp. I'd been told the fishing was excellent there, rainbow trout nearly jumping onto your hook. The hike was harder than we expected. The trail wasn't well maintained, with sections that were overgrown or washed out in places. After about 3 hours, we passed the last group of hikers we'd see that day, an older couple who were heading back to the trailhead. They warned us there had been some bear activity in the area, which made Matt a bit nervous, but the rest of us figured we'd be fine as long as we secured our food properly. We pushed on for another 3 hours, moving deeper into the wilderness. It was getting late in the afternoon, and we were all pretty beat. I don't think any of us realized just how isolated this place was going to be. The terrain kept getting more rugged, with steep hills on both sides of the trail and dense forest all around. The river ran alongside us, sometimes close to the path, sometimes dropping away into small gorges. Around 5 p.m., we finally found a decent spot to make camp. It was a small clearing next to the river with a natural fire pit that had clearly been used by other campers in the past. There were hills on both sides, and across the river was a steep slope with a trail running along it maybe 10-15 yards away from where we were setting up. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and Steve, who was always the most outdoorsy of our group, got a nice fire going. Jim and I tried our luck fishing while there was still daylight, but we only caught a couple of small ones, nothing worth keeping. So we broke out the food we'd packed, canned beans, hot dogs, and some beers we'd been lugging around all day. The sun had set, but our campfire was roaring, casting this orange glow over everything. I remember feeling pretty content at that moment. We were sitting around the fire, swapping stories, laughing. Matt was telling us about this girl he'd met at community college. The stars were unbelievable. You just don't see skies like that in the city. It was around 9:30 p.m. when we heard it. There was this loud crashing sound from across the river, up on the hillside. At first, I thought it was a boulder rolling down or maybe a tree falling. We all stopped talking and looked up toward the noise. That's when I saw it, and my entire understanding of the world shifted. There was a trail that ran along the hillside opposite our camp, and on that trail was something. Something massive was running down that path, moving surprisingly fast for its size. The firelight illuminated it just enough that I could make out the basic shape and features. It was unmistakably walking on 2 legs, but it wasn't human, not even close. "Holy shit!" Steve yelled, jumping to his feet. "What the fuck is that?" At the sound of Steve's voice, the thing turned its head and looked directly at us. That moment is burned into my memory. This massive, hulking figure, pausing just long enough to acknowledge our presence. It didn't slow down, though. It just kept running along the trail, and within seconds had disappeared over a ridge. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 to 6 seconds, but those seconds have replayed in my mind thousands of times over the years. What did I see? It was bipedal, walking upright on 2 legs like a human, but it was covered in dark hair, almost black, but in the firelight it looked more like a deep brown. The hair wasn't super long and matted like you see in some depictions. It looked more like a thick, even coat covering its entire body. The shoulders on this thing were impossibly wide, at least 4 feet across, maybe more. It was built like a heavyweight bodybuilder times 2, with massive arms and a thick torso. I'd guess it stood between 6.5 and 7 feet tall, though it was hard to judge exactly from our vantage point. If I had to guess the weight, I'd say well over 300 pounds, all of it looking like pure muscle. The thing that really struck me was how it moved. Despite its size, it ran with this fluid, athletic motion. And the sound, each footfall made this deep, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Jim later described it as thunderous, which is pretty accurate. It wasn't crashing through brush, it was running on the established trail, but each step had this weight behind it that no human could produce. Oddly enough, despite being downwind from it, none of us detected any smell. I've heard stories about these creatures having a powerful stench, but I didn't notice anything like that. After it disappeared, the 4 of us just stood there in shock. staring at the empty hillside. Matt was the first to speak. Was that... did we just see a... Bigfoot? The word hung in the air. None of us had said it until that moment, but we were all thinking it. There was simply no other explanation that made sense. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't run bipedally like that. It wasn't a person in a suit. No costume could replicate that natural movement or physical presence. And who would be out here, miles from civilization, playing a prank? We need to get out of here, Jim said, already starting to pack up his things. Right now. It's pitch black, I pointed out, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart. We can't hike out in the dark. We'd get lost or fall off a cliff. We debated our options for a good 20 minutes. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, but the rational side of my brain knew that would be more dangerous than staying put. Whatever we'd seen hadn't approached us or shown any aggression. In fact, it seemed just as eager to avoid us as we were to avoid it. Eventually, we decided to stay, but take precautions. We moved our tents closer together and agreed that we'd sleep in shifts, 2 awake, 2 asleep at all times. We stoked the fire as high as we could get it and gathered all our food into one bag, which we hung from a tree branch away from our camp. I don't think any of us really slept that night. I know I didn't. During my watch with Steve, we just sat there, backs to each other, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. Every sound in the forest, every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. "What do you think it was doing out here?" Steve whispered at one point. "Same as us, probably," I replied. "Just passing through." The night dragged on endlessly. By dawn, we were all exhausted, jumpy, and ready to get the hell out of there. But before we packed up, curiosity got the better of me. "I want to check out that trail," I said, pointing to where we'd seen the creature. "Are you insane?" Matt looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "It's gone," I said. "It took off running. I need to see if there are tracks." Jim agreed to come with me, while Steve and Matt started breaking down the camp. We crossed the river at a shallow point and climbed up to the trail. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and rock, not ideal for leaving footprints. We walked along the path, scanning for any sign of what had passed by the night before. "Look at this!" Jim called out after a few minutes. I hurried over to where he was crouched down. There was a small section of softer earth, and in it was nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no evidence at all. We searched for nearly an hour along that trail and found absolutely nothing to confirm what we'd seen. That absence of evidence bothered me more than anything else. It was as if the creature had been a shared hallucination, except I know what I saw. We all saw it. We hiked out that morning, moving at a pace that bordered on dangerous, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste to get back to civilization. No one suggested stopping to fish or rest. We just wanted out. The drive back was mostly silent. I think we were all processing what had happened in our own ways. It wasn't until we stopped for burgers about an hour from home that anyone brought it up. "We need to decide what we're telling people," Jim said, picking at his fries. "The truth," I replied immediately. Steve shook his head. "No way. People will think we're crazy. Or attention-seeking liars," Matt added. They were right, of course. This was 1982. There was no internet where you could anonymously share strange experiences. If we started telling people we'd seen Bigfoot, it would affect our reputations, our relationships, maybe even my teaching career. So we made a pact. We would keep it between the 4 of us, at least for the time being. Maybe someday, when we had more evidence or when people were more open-minded, we'd share our story. But for now, it would remain our secret. That was 40 years ago. I'm retired now, and I think enough time has passed that I can finally talk about what happened without worrying about the consequences. Matt, Steve, and I still get together once a year to have a beer and talk about that night. Jim passed away from cancer in 2008. None of us has ever wavered in what we saw. Over the years, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and similar encounters. I've read about the Patterson-Gimlin film and countless other accounts. Some seem credible, others less so. I've never gone public with our story until now, and I've never gone back to that spot on the Mariana River. The experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. As a science teacher, I had always believed in what could be proven, what could be studied and catalogued. But that night showed me there are things in this world that defy easy classification, that exist in the spaces between what we know for certain and what we dismiss as impossible. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe this story if someone else told it to me, but I know what I saw on that hillside in the spring of 1982. 4 rational, sober adults witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to conventional science. Yet there it was, as real as the ground beneath our feet or the stars over our heads. Sometimes I still wake up at night, heart pounding, the image of that massive figure turning to look at us, still fresh in my mind. What haunts me isn't fear exactly. It's the knowledge that I glimpsed something profound, a mystery that has shared this planet with us all along, just beyond the edge of our awareness. And sometimes, when I'm out hiking or camping in the years since, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'm being watched, wondering if, somewhere in the dense forests that still cover parts of our country, that creature or others like it are still out there, moving silently through the wilderness, careful to stay just out of sight of human eyes. Story 8. I've never really shared this story anywhere before, but after all these years I still can't explain what happened. It's one of those experiences that makes you question everything you think you know about the world around us. It was August 30th, 2002. My husband Tom and I had planned a camping trip with our daughters Emma, 7, and Lily, 5, along with my friend Jennifer and her kids. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, just a chance to get away from our busy lives in the Bay Area and enjoy some time in nature. We packed up our minivan that Friday afternoon and headed out to Sierra County, a place we'd camped several times before. The drive was about 4 hours from our home in San Jose. We left later than planned because Tom had to finish up some work, so by the time we reached Sierra County, the sun was already setting. I remember being a little anxious about arriving at the campground after dark, but we'd stayed at Sierra Pines campground several times before, so I figured we'd manage okay. When we finally pulled up to Sierra Pines around 8:30 p.m., my heart sank. The campground was completely full, not a single spot available. We sat in the car, tired and frustrated, trying to figure out what to do. Jennifer suggested we try finding another campground nearby, so we consulted our map. This was before smartphones were common, and noticed there was another smaller campground about 7 miles down a Forest Service road. By this point, it was fully dark, and we were all exhausted and cranky. The kids were whining in the back seat, and I just wanted to get somewhere and set up camp. We decided to try the other campground, even though none of us had ever been there before. The road to this other campground, I think it was called Manzanita Creek or something similar, was unpaved and rough. Our headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a narrow path ahead as we bounced along the dirt road. I remember feeling increasingly uneasy as we got further from the main road, but I chalked it up to being tired and frustrated about our plans changing. When we finally arrived at the campground, it was almost completely empty, which should have been our first clue something was off. Why would one campground be completely full while another just a few miles away was deserted? But at that point, we were just relieved to have found a place to camp. We chose a spot that seemed relatively flat and close to what looked like a path leading to the bathrooms. Tom and I started unloading our gear, while Jennifer offered to take our daughters and her kids to use the outhouse before we got too settled in. About 10 minutes later, they came back, and I immediately noticed their expressions. Jennifer had this weird look on her face, and the kids were holding their noses. "That outhouse is disgusting," Jennifer said. "The smell is unbelievable." The kids were all dramatically pinching their noses and making gagging sounds, which I figured was just them being kids and overreacting. Jennifer explained that the outhouse was down in a small gully about 40 feet from our campsite, and that it smelled worse than any bathroom she'd ever encountered. "Probably just needs to be pumped," Tom said, shrugging it off. "These vault toilets get pretty bad if they haven't been serviced in a while." We continued setting up camp, got the tent pitched, and started a small fire. By then, it was close to 10 p.m., and we were all exhausted. After roasting a few marshmallows and having some snacks, we decided to call it a night. Just as we were getting ready to tuck the kids into the tent, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I'd been avoiding it after Jennifer's description, but I couldn't hold it until morning. I asked Emma to show me the way since she'd already been there with Jennifer. "I don't want to go back there, Mom," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "It smells too bad." Tom offered to come with us, grabbing his flashlight. Emma reluctantly agreed to lead the way, but insisted on holding my hand the entire time. I had my own small pocket flashlight that didn't give off much light, but it was enough to see the path. As we walked away from the campfire's glow, the darkness seemed to press in around us. The forest was eerily quiet. No cicadas, no frogs, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just silence. I remember thinking how strange that was, since forests usually have some ambient noise, especially at night. Emma led us down a narrow dirt path that veered to the right of our campsite. The path dipped downward, and I could feel the ground sloping beneath my feet. My little flashlight barely illuminated a few feet ahead, but I could make out that we were heading into a small depression or gully. As we descended about 10 feet below the level of our campsite, the smell hit me. It's hard to describe exactly what it was like. Not just the usual outhouse smell, this was something different. Raw, musky, almost meaty, like rotting animal carcass mixed with something else I couldn't identify. It made my eyes water instantly. "See, Mom, I told you it was bad," Emma whispered, tugging on my hand. "It's just an old outhouse," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's get this over with." The outhouse was about 30 feet away now, a dark silhouette against the even darker woods behind it. I pointed my flashlight toward the structure, and that's when I saw them. Two glowing red eyes reflecting back at my light, standing at what seemed to be about my height. I'm 5'6", or a bit taller. I froze. Those eyes were looking directly at us. They weren't like animal eyes that typically have a greenish or yellowish reflection. These were distinctly red, like two burning coals, and they were perfectly still, watching us. Then, as I kept my light fixed on them, the eyes seemed to drop downward, as if whatever it was had crouched down. That movement broke my paralysis. "We're going back," I said, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. I tightened my grip on Emma's hand and started backing up the path. "What is it?" Tom asked from behind us. "There's something there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for Emma's sake. "By the outhouse, I saw eyes." Tom immediately moved past us, his much stronger flashlight sweeping the area. "Where exactly?" "Right in front of the outhouse door," I said, already pulling Emma back up the path. "I'm taking her back to camp." I practically dragged Emma back up the slope to our campsite, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When we got back, Jennifer must have seen the look on my face, because she immediately stood up from where she'd been sitting by the fire. "What happened?" she asked. "I saw something at the outhouse," I said, trying to keep my voice down so I wouldn't scare the kids more than they already were. "Eyes, red eyes." Jennifer looked skeptical but concerned. "Like an animal? A bear, maybe?" I shook my head. The eyes were too high off the ground for a bear, unless it was standing, but then it would have been huge. Tom returned about 5 minutes later with Jennifer's husband, Mike, who had gone down to check things out with him. They both looked confused rather than scared. "We didn't see anything," Tom said. "Checked all around the outhouse and even looked inside." "The smell is gone too," Mike added. "Or at least it's not nearly as bad as it was earlier." I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my head, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a deer? No, the eyes were too high and the wrong color. A bear standing on its hind legs? Maybe. But what bear would just stand there, then crouch down instead of running away when spotted? And why would the terrible smell suddenly disappear? When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight filtering through the trees. The campsite looked completely normal in the light of day, just a small, somewhat overgrown clearing surrounded by pine trees. Tom and Mike went to check out the outhouse area again, while Jennifer and I made breakfast for the kids. When they came back, Tom had a strange look on his face. "You need to come see this," he said quietly to me. I followed him down the path to the outhouse, feeling my anxiety rise with each step. In the daylight, I could see that the outhouse was actually quite old and dilapidated, with weathered wood and a metal roof that had partially caved in on one side. But what Tom wanted to show me wasn't the outhouse itself. "Look at these," he said, pointing to several small trees around the outhouse. They were uprooted and pushed over, their roots exposed. Not broken or chewed like beaver damage, just pushed over, as if something very strong had shoved them aside. "And look here," Tom said, pointing to the ground in front of the outhouse. There were some indentations in the dirt that might have been footprints, but they were smeared and unclear. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, something else occurred to me that made my blood run cold. Whatever had been standing there when I pointed my flashlight at it would have been much taller than I initially thought. "Tom," I said slowly, "when I saw those eyes last night, I thought they were about my height. But from where I was standing on the path, looking down into this gully, you were looking downhill," Tom finished my thought, "which means whatever you saw would have been 7 or 8 feet tall at least," I whispered. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. None of us felt comfortable staying another night, especially with the kids. As we were packing, I remembered something that had happened earlier that month that I hadn't connected until now. We'd been camping at another site in Sierra County, about 20 miles from this one. One morning, we'd woken up to find someone or something had raided our camp during the night. A sealed Tupperware container of trail mix was missing, along with a large pork loin roast we'd been planning to cook for dinner. The strange part was that the next morning we found the Tupperware container placed neatly behind our campsite. The lid was set next to it, not thrown aside or damaged, and all the trail mix was gone. Nearby was the largest pile of animal droppings I'd ever seen, way too big for a raccoon or even a normal-sized bear. At the time, Tom had joked that Smokey the bear had stopped by for a midnight snack. But now I wasn't so sure it had been a bear at all. The scat didn't look like bear droppings. It was different in both size and composition. As we drove away from that campground, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, according to science. Something that walks upright, stands 7 to 8 feet tall, has red reflective eyes, and leaves behind an unmistakable musky odor. I've done a lot of research since then, reading accounts of similar encounters in the Sierra Nevada region. I've even reluctantly looked into Sasquatch or Bigfoot stories, something I would have laughed at before that night. Many of these accounts describe similar details: the height, the eyes, the smell that seems to come and go. It's been over 20 years since that night, and I still get chills thinking about those glowing red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. We never went back to that campground again, and for several years after, I couldn't bring myself to go camping at all. I don't know what I saw that night in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I can't explain it logically, and I've tried. All I know is that something was watching us from the darkness, something tall, Something strong enough to uproot trees, something intelligent enough to open a sealed container without damaging it, and something that, for whatever reason, didn't want to be seen. I still wonder sometimes if it's still out there, watching other campers from the shadows. Story 9. I've never told many people about what happened to me that day in 1964. For the longest time, I thought people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. Even now, typing this out, my hands are shaking a bit. It's been almost 60 years, but I can still see it clear as day when I close my eyes. I was 16 that summer. My dad had given me a .32 caliber carbine for my birthday earlier that year, and I'd spend most weekends hunting in the hills about 20 miles from our house in Northern California. Dad worked Saturdays at the lumber mill, so I'd usually go alone once I proved I could handle myself in the woods. That particular day in July started like any other hunting trip. I woke up before dawn, packed some sandwiches my mom made, bologna and cheese, I can still taste them, filled my canteen, and loaded up my carbine. Dad was already at work, but he'd left a note reminding me to be back before dark and to bring home something good for Sunday dinner. That was the last normal moment of my life before everything changed. I drove our old pickup to my usual spot and hiked about 2 miles into the woods. It was still early, maybe 7:30 in the morning, but already getting warm. California summers, you know. The air had that special smell of pine and dry earth that I can't really describe, but takes me right back there whenever I catch a whiff of something similar. I found a good spot overlooking a fire lane, basically a wide dirt path cut through the forest that the Forest Service maintained to help fight wildfires. It was a smart place to wait, because deer would often use it as an easy path through the dense forest. I settled in against a fallen log, carbine ready across my lap, and waited. The first few hours were uneventful. I saw a couple squirrels, some birds, but no deer. By around noon, I was getting restless and thinking about moving to a different spot after eating my lunch. That's when I heard it. A crashing sound through the underbrush on the other side of the fire lane, maybe 40 yards away. My first thought was, finally, a deer. I quietly set my canteen down and brought my carbine up, finger resting beside the trigger like my dad taught me. I was ready. What stepped out of those bushes wasn't a deer. I remember every detail like it was burned into my brain. First, the way the bushes parted, not like when a deer pushes through, but deliberately, like when a person uses their hands to move branches aside. Then this thing just walked out and stood there in the middle of the fire lane. It was standing upright. That's what hit me first. My brain was trying to categorize it. Bear, no. Deer, definitely not. My thoughts were racing, and the phrase that popped into my head was monkey man. That's honestly what I thought. It looks like a monkey man. I had the carbine up to my shoulder, sights lined up, finger moving to the trigger. I was about to squeeze when something stopped me. I don't know how to explain it. People might call it divine intervention or instinct or whatever, but something in my head just said, no, clear as day. So I held my fire but kept it in my sights. That's when I really saw it. The thing was huge, I'd guess between 7 and 8 feet tall. Its arms were long and muscular, hanging down to its waist, ending in hands that looked almost human but larger. The entire body was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but long hair, maybe 3-4 inches. Its chest was massive like a barrel. I remember thinking no bodybuilder I'd ever seen in magazines had a chest that big. The face is what I remember most clearly. It had a flat, square jaw, kind of like a person, but different. The nose was flat and dark, and there was no hair on its face, which made it stand out against all that brown hair covering the rest of it. The forehead sloped back, and I couldn't see any ears or even a neck, really, just hair. As I was taking all this in, the creature turned toward me from the waist up. It didn't turn its whole body, just the upper half, almost like it had sensed me. Our eyes met through my gun sights, and I swear it knew I was there. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My finger was frozen beside the trigger. It just looked at me. No aggression, no fear, just awareness. Like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. The whole thing probably lasted 10-15 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, as calmly as it had appeared, it took about 2 strides across the fire lane. 2 strides. The fire lane was at least 12 feet wide, and it crossed it in 2 steps. Those legs were massive. It reached the other side and used its arms to part the tall bushes, pushing them aside like curtains. Then it stepped into the brush and disappeared from view. Except it didn't leave. I could tell it was still there, standing just inside the bushes, watching me. I couldn't see it clearly anymore, but I could make out its shape behind the foliage. It stood there for about a minute, just watching. That's when real fear hit me. I was frozen against that log, carbine still pointed but my arm starting to shake. What if it charged me? What if there were more of them? I had to do something. I slowly stood up, keeping the gun ready. I decided right then that if it came at me, I'd fire, but otherwise I was going to back away and run if I had to. I wasn't about to turn my back on it. After what felt like forever, the bushes where it was standing started shaking violently. I could hear branches breaking and the sound of heavy footsteps moving away from me. It was leaving. I didn't move for at least 15 minutes. I just stood there, listening to the forest, trying to hear if it was coming back. All I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears and my own ragged breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was gone. Curiosity got the better of me. I know it was stupid, but I had to see for myself. I approached the spot where the creature had crossed the fire lane, carbine at the ready, checking in all directions. The ground told the story. There, in the loose dirt of the fire lane, were tracks. Huge barefoot tracks that looked almost human, but much larger. I put my boot next to one for comparison. I wore size 10 shoes back then, and this print was at least twice as long and much wider. The toes were clearly visible, 5 of them, spread out like it had never worn shoes. And the smell. God, the smell. It hit me as soon as I got close to where it had been standing. It was this raunchy, almost fart-like odor that made my eyes water. Not exactly like an animal, not exactly like anything I'd ever smelled before. It reminded me a little of when our dog got sprayed by a skunk, but mixed with something else, something worse. I didn't stick around long after that. I practically ran back to the truck, checking over my shoulder the whole way. I kept the carbine ready and stopped every few minutes to listen, convinced I was being followed. The normal forest sounds seemed threatening now. Every snapping twig made me jump. When I got back to the truck, I threw my gear in, started it up, and got out of there as fast as I could on those dirt roads. I didn't stop shaking until I was back on the main highway. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my dad, not my friends, nobody. What would I say? Hey, Dad, I saw a giant hairy man thing in the woods today. He'd have thought I was making it up or hallucinating or something, so I kept my mouth shut. When he asked if I'd seen anything worth shooting, I just said, "Nothing worth bringing home," and left it at that. For years afterward, I avoided that part of the forest. I still went hunting, but always with someone else, and never in that area. I'd make up excuses about why we should try different spots. Eventually, I moved away for college and then work, and the whole thing became this weird memory I carried around. It wasn't until the 1970s when people started talking more about Bigfoot, and I saw that famous Patterson-Gimlin film, that I realized what I might have seen. The proportions were similar, the long arms, the barrel chest, the way it walked. But even then, I kept quiet. Who'd believe me? Now I'm an old man, and I guess it doesn't matter much anymore what people think. I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a guy in a costume playing a prank. It was something else, something not exactly animal but not human either. The thing that sticks with me most, even after all these years, isn't the size or the smell or even how it looked. It's the way it looked at me, with intelligence, with awareness, like it was making a decision about me the same way I was making one about it. It could have charged me. I was just a skinny kid with a small caliber rifle. But it didn't. It just walked away. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd pulled that trigger. Would anyone have believed me if I'd brought back proof? Or would something terrible have happened instead? I think about that no voice in my head that stopped me from shooting, and I'm grateful for it. I've never gone back to that exact spot. I've thought about it many times, especially in recent years as I've gotten older. Part of me wants to see if there's any trace left, any evidence of what happened. But another part is still afraid, not of seeing it again, but of not seeing anything at all. What if I go back and there's nothing there? What if I can't find that fire lane or that fallen log? What if I've built this whole thing up in my head for 60 years? But then I close my eyes and I can see it standing there looking at me through my gun sights, and I know it was real. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it was real. And for a brief moment in the summer of 1964, our worlds crossed. I still have dreams about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I'm sitting in those woods again, waiting, only in the dreams. When it sees me, it doesn't walk away. It comes over and tries to communicate somehow. I always wake up before I can understand what it wants to tell me. I don't know if anyone will believe this account. I'm not sure I would if someone told me the same story. But it happened. And all these years later, I still wonder if that thing is out there somewhere in the California woods, or if it's long gone now, just like my youth. Story 10. And I've been sitting on this story for over 70 years now. I'm an old woman, and I figure it's finally time to share what happened to me back in 1950. I was 12 years old then, and what I saw that day in the Los Padres National Forest has stayed with me my entire life. I grew up in Ojai, California. It was a different world back then. Kids had more freedom, for better or worse. I was a bit of a wild child, always butting heads with my parents. Whenever things got too heated at home, I'd pack a small bag and take off on my horse, Pepper. Usually I'd camp out for a night or two until I cooled down. My parents knew I could handle myself in the woods. I'd been riding since I was 6, and my dad had taught me basic survival skills. They weren't happy about my little escapes, but they knew where I went and that I'd come back when I was ready. That particular day in early summer, I'd had a huge fight with my mom about something so trivial I can't even remember what it was now. I stormed out, grabbed my canvas pack with some jerky, matches, a canteen, and a light blanket. I saddled up Pepper and rode off toward the mountains. The Los Padres National Forest was practically our backyard, and I had my usual spots where I'd set up camp when I needed to clear my head. The day was beautiful, sunny, warm but not hot, with a light breeze carrying the scent of pine and chaparral. I remember feeling the weight of my anger gradually lifting as Pepper and I made our way deeper into the forest. The trails were familiar to me, and I felt completely at ease. I had no idea that in a few hours I'd experience something that would change me forever. After riding for about 2 hours, I decided to explore a trail I'd only been on once or twice before. It wasn't anything special, just less traveled than my usual routes. The trail wound around the side of a hill, with a small stream running maybe 30 feet below. As I rounded a bend, I pulled Pepper to a stop. There, at the edge of the stream, were 3 figures. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. They were crouched down on all fours at the water's edge, their heads lowered to the surface as they drank directly from the stream. They were covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but hair, a brownish-reddish color that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. I just sat there on Pepper, trying to process what I was looking at. They weren't bears. I knew bears well enough. These creatures had a different shape altogether. Their bodies were more like humans, but covered in hair. Pepper didn't spook or act nervous, which was weird because she'd always get skittish around bears or even deer sometimes. She just stood there, as curious as I was, for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. They didn't notice us. Then, almost simultaneously, all three of them sensed our presence. The largest one turned its head slowly and looked right at us. Our eyes met, and I felt something I still can't fully explain. Not fear, not exactly recognition, just a strange sense of awareness. The largest one, I think it was an adolescent like a teenager, slowly rose to a standing position. The two smaller ones followed suit, and they all stood there looking at us. Standing upright, I could see them more clearly. The biggest one was a bit taller than me, maybe 5'3" or 5'4". I was about 5 feet tall then, so I had a good reference. The two smaller ones were much shorter, around 3.5 feet tall. What struck me most was how human-like they appeared despite being so different. They had brow ridges that protruded a bit, but not as much as in pictures of cavemen I'd seen in school books. Their noses were broad and flat, and the shape of their heads was remarkably human, though I couldn't see any ears through the hair. The hair covered their bodies completely, but it wasn't shaggy or matted like you'd expect on a wild animal. It was more uniform, I guess. I don't know why I did what I did next. It was pure instinct. I raised my hand with my palm facing outward like a greeting. I wasn't scared. That's what still amazes me to this day. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Neither was Pepper, who just stood calmly beneath me. The teenage creature, that's how I've come to think of it, looked at my raised hand for a moment. Then slowly and deliberately it raised its own hand and mirrored my gesture. Palm out, facing me. It wasn't mimicking me like a monkey might. It understood I was greeting it, and it was greeting me back. The two smaller creatures, children I assume now, stood close to the adolescent, staring at me with dark eyes that reflected intelligence. I could feel them assessing me, much as I was assessing them. There was curiosity in those eyes, not hostility or fear. After our brief exchange of greetings, the adolescent lowered its hand and reached down to take the hands of the two smaller creatures. The gesture was so tender, so human, that it took my breath away. Then, without any sign of hurry or alarm, they turned away from the stream and walked up the opposite trail, disappearing over the ridge of the hill. They walked upright the entire time, on two legs, with a gait that was unmistakably bipedal, but had a kind of rolling quality to it. Their arms swung naturally at their sides, except where the adolescent held the hands of the little ones. I watched until they disappeared from view, the entire encounter lasting maybe 3 or 4 minutes at most. When they were gone, I just sat there on Pepper, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I knew I hadn't imagined it. The creatures were real, solid, physical beings, but they weren't anything I could identify from my limited knowledge of the world. This was 1950. Nobody talked about Bigfoot or Sasquatch back then, at least not in Southern California. Those stories came later, and when they did, they always described these hulking, aggressive monsters. What I saw was nothing like that. I remember dismounting and walking Pepper down to the stream where the creatures had been. I examined the bank, looking for footprints, but the ground was rocky there and didn't hold impressions well. I did find a few broken twigs and some flattened grass where they'd crouched. I touched the water where their mouths had been, feeling a strange connection to these unknown beings. As the sun started to lower in the sky, I realized I needed to set up camp. I found a small clearing about a half-mile away, tied Pepper to a tree where she could graze, and set up my simple camp. I built a small fire, ate some jerky, and sat with my blanket wrapped around my shoulders, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. I wasn't afraid to be in the woods that night. If anything, I felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever those creatures were, they hadn't shown any aggression toward me. The adolescent's gesture of greeting and the way it had protected the little ones spoke of intelligence and even kindness. I fell asleep under the stars, my mind full of questions. The next morning, I packed up and headed back home. My anger had completely dissipated, replaced by wonder at what I'd experienced. When I got home, my parents were relieved to see me, as always. They asked where I'd been, and I told them I'd camped in the usual spots. I didn't mention the creatures. Even at 12, I knew that telling that story would lead to disbelief at best and ridicule at worst. I went back to that same spot several times over the next few years, hoping to see the creatures again, but I never did. As I grew older and learned about the concept of Bigfoot, I realized that what I'd seen might have been related to those legends. But the descriptions never quite matched my experience. The creatures I saw weren't 8 feet tall and intimidating. They were smaller, more human-sized, and their behavior was peaceful, even familial. I've often wondered about those creatures over the decades. Were they a family unit, a parent with 2 children? Were there more of them living in the Los Padres? How had they remained hidden for so long? What happened to them? Are they still out there? I've read scientific articles about unclassified primates and watched documentaries about Bigfoot sightings, but nothing has ever perfectly aligned with what I saw. The closest match might be what anthropologists call relict hominids, some unknown species of human-like creature that somehow survived alongside us. The most remarkable thing about my encounter was the complete lack of fear, both mine and theirs. It was as if we recognized each other as intelligent beings who meant no harm. That mutual recognition has stayed with me all these years. I'm sharing this now because at my age, I don't care much about being believed or not. I know what I saw. I was a clear-headed, observant 12-year-old with good eyesight and no reason to make up stories. Those creatures were real. The adolescent's returned greeting was real. The gentle way it took the hands of the smaller ones was real. Sometimes I dream about them, still crossing over that ridge, disappearing into the wilderness. I wonder if they remember me too, the human girl on horseback who raised her hand in greeting instead of running away in fear. I like to think they do. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. I've carried this memory for over 70 years now, keeping it mostly to myself. My late husband knew, and my children, but few others. Most people who've heard it probably think it's the imagination of a young girl or the confused memory of an old woman, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, on clear nights when I can see the stars, I still wonder about them. My forest friends from that summer day in 1950. Story 11. I still can't believe what I saw that day. I've gone back and forth about posting this for years now, but I need to get it off my chest. This happened back in 1980, when my buddy Mike and I were driving through British Columbia near Kitimat. It was early fall, I remember, because the leaves were just starting to turn, and there was this crisp feeling in the air. We'd been out fishing most of the day and were heading back along Highway 37, coming up on William Creek Flats around dusk. If you've never been there, it's this marshy area with lots of standing water and thick vegetation. Beautiful country, but remote as hell. The weather had been weird that day, not exactly raining, but misty enough that a thick ground fog had settled in all the low spots. Mike was driving his old Ford pickup, and I was riding shotgun, just shooting the breeze about our fishing haul. We were coming around this bend in the road where there's a swampy area that dips down from the highway. The fog was especially thick there, like a white blanket covering everything below road level. I remember feeling drowsy, just staring out at the fog, when Mike suddenly hit the brakes. "Hey, you see that? There's someone waving at us from the side of the road," he said. I sat up straight and squinted through the passenger window. Sure enough, about 30 yards ahead, I could make out what looked like a person standing just off the shoulder, arm moving back and forth. In that moment, My first thought was that someone had broken down or gotten stuck in the mud. "Should we stop?" I asked, though Mike was already slowing down. "Yeah, man. Can't leave someone stranded out here. It'll be dark soon." As we pulled over to the side of the road, I remember feeling a slight unease. Something felt off. The figure was partially obscured by the fog, and I couldn't make out any car or vehicle nearby. Still, we were Canadian boys raised to help others, so we didn't think twice about stopping. Mike brought the truck to a halt right alongside where we'd seen the figure. We both leaned forward to look out my passenger window, expecting to see someone approach the truck. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind countless times over the years. As the truck settled and our headlights cut through some of the mist, I realized the person wasn't standing on the roadside at all. It was actually down in the swamp, at the bottom of a small grade that sloped away from the highway. And it wasn't a person. The creature, because that's the only way I can describe it, was standing in water that came up to about mid-calf on it. It was tall, much taller than any man I've ever seen, 7 feet at minimum, maybe closer to 8, and it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, more like a thick coat of hair that hung from its body in a way that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of orangutans, but darker, more brown-black. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. It wasn't animal-like at all. It had a face that was almost human, but not quite. The hair covered most of it, like a really full beard that extended up the cheeks. But the features were distinctly humanoid. The nose was flat and broad, the lips fuller than a human's, but definitely lips, not a muzzle. When our headlights hit it, the creature's eyes widened. I could clearly see the whites of its eyes grow large, with what I can only describe as shock or fear. Its mouth opened in what looked like an O of surprise. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a second or two, we just stared at each other. Me and Mike frozen in the cab of the truck, and this thing standing in the swamp water equally stunned. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. It threw its head back and brought its arms up, crossing them over its head like it was protecting itself from a blow. The gesture was so human, so vulnerable, it sent a chill through me. It turned away from us in one fluid motion and began moving through the swamp, away from the road. It didn't run exactly, it was wading through water that in some spots came up to its knees. But it moved with purpose, taking these long strides that carried it quickly into the deeper fog. I remember watching it go, how it navigated the swamp with familiarity, stepping over submerged logs or around deeper holes, as if it knew exactly where they were. It never looked back, just kept moving away until the fog swallowed it up. Mike and I sat there in complete silence for what must have been a full minute. I could hear his breathing, fast and shallow. Did you see that?" he finally whispered. I couldn't even form words. I just nodded. "What the hell was it?" Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I don't know," I managed to say. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. But it wasn't human. We debated whether to get out and look for tracks, but neither of us wanted to leave the safety of the truck. The sun was getting lower, and the idea of being outside with that thing potentially still nearby was too much. Plus, the ground was so wet and marshy that I doubted we'd find clear tracks anyway. Mike put the truck in gear, and we drove off. For the first few miles, we didn't speak. Then, as if a dam broke, we started talking over each other, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. "It must have been a bear," Mike said at one point, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that. "Bears don't stand like that," I replied, "and they don't have faces like people." "Sasquatch," Mike finally said, almost in a whisper. "It had to be." I'd grown up hearing Sasquatch stories. In northern BC, they're as common as ghost stories elsewhere. But I'd always written them off as tall tales, something to scare tourists or explain strange noises in the woods. Now I wasn't so sure. The more we talked, the more details came back to me. The creature hadn't been waving for help like we first thought. Looking back, I realized it had been reaching up to pull down branches from a bush that was growing on the higher ground near the road. It must have been feeding, pulling the vegetation toward itself. From our angle coming around the curve, with the fog obscuring the lower part of its body, it had looked like someone standing on the roadside, waving an arm. Its position along that curved section of road created an optical illusion. We thought it was on the shoulder, but it was actually several feet down and away in the swamp itself. But the detail that stuck with me most was its reaction. That look of surprise, almost fear. The way it protected its head and then fled. It wasn't aggressive. If anything, it seemed more frightened of us than we were of it. We made it back to town and spent the night at Mike's place, drinking beers and trying to process what we'd seen. We agreed to tell his brother Tom, who was a bit of an outdoorsman and had connections with some local indigenous elders who might know something. Tom listened to our story without interrupting, then made some calls. A couple days later, this guy showed up who said he investigated Sasquatch sightings. I was skeptical at first, worried he'd be some kook, but he turned out to be pretty level-headed. He took detailed notes about everything: the location, the time of day, the weather conditions, our exact descriptions of the creature. He was particularly interested in my observation about the creature's face. Most people describe them as ape-like, he said, but a lot of witnesses, especially those who get a close look, report very human-like features under all that hair. He theorized that what we saw was a young male Sasquatch that had been feeding on berry bushes that grow along that stretch of road. The heavy fog had given it confidence to venture closer to the highway than it normally would. We took him out to the spot a few days later, but of course there was nothing to find. The swampy ground wouldn't hold tracks, and any disturbed vegetation couldn't be distinguished from normal wildlife activity. That was 43 years ago now. Mike passed away from cancer in 2011, and I've never told many people about what we saw. Those I have told usually give me that look, the one that says they think I'm either lying or was somehow mistaken about what I saw. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't a guy in a suit. Whatever it was a surprise to see us as we were to see it. I've been back to that stretch of highway many times over the years. Never seen anything like it again. The logging industry moved in during the 90s, and a lot of that area has been cleared now. I wonder sometimes if it's still out there, or if its habitat has been destroyed like so much of our wilderness. I don't have any grand conclusions or evidence to offer, just my experience, for whatever it's worth. I know in my bones that what I saw that day was real. Something exists out there in the remote parts of British Columbia that science hasn't classified. Something that walks upright, has hands that can grasp branches, and eyes that can register fear. Every time I drive a lonely stretch of highway at dusk, especially when the fog rolls in, I find myself scanning the roadside, not out of fear but hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I'll get another glimpse of whatever it was I saw that day. But in 43 years, it hasn't happened again. I'm starting to think it never will. Story 12. I've never told this story outside of my immediate family and a few close friends. Even now, over 40 years later, I still question what I saw that night in November 1981. I was 26 years old, working for a small timber company, and had been in Whistler meeting with potential clients. The meetings ran late, and I found myself driving back to Vancouver well after dark. It was a cold, clear night, November 12th, and the temperature was dropping fast. My old Ford pickup wasn't the most reliable, especially in the cold, so I was anxious to get home before anything could go wrong. I remember the dashboard clock read 11:17 p.m. when I pulled into the Pine Creek rest area just north of Squamish. I wasn't planning to stop for long, just needed to stretch my legs, use the restroom, and maybe grab a coffee from my thermos before continuing south. The rest area was completely deserted. No other cars in the parking lot. Just the dull yellow glow of a single lamppost and the dense wall of Douglas firs surrounding everything. Pine Creek rest stop wasn't much. Just a small gravelled lot with a pit toilet, a couple picnic tables, and access to a small lake that most tourists never even noticed was there. I remember feeling uneasy as soon as I stepped out of my truck. Not scared exactly, but that feeling you get when something's not quite right. The air was unnaturally still, no wind, no distant highway sounds, just complete silence, the kind that makes your ears strain for something, anything. I used the restroom quickly and walked back to my truck. That's when I noticed how bright the moon was, nearly full, and casting everything in this pale blue light. I decided to sit in my truck for a few minutes, with the engine running to warm up before hitting the road again. I kept the headlights on, pointed toward the trail that led down to the lake. Wasn't really thinking about it, just didn't want to sit in complete darkness. I poured some coffee from my thermos and took a sip, staring absently at the illuminated trail. That's when I first noticed movement at the edge of my headlight's reach. Something dark was moving near the water's edge, maybe 50 yards away. My first thought was bear, not uncommon in the area, especially near water sources. I remember setting my coffee down carefully, not wanting to spill it, and leaning forward to get a better look. The figure was hunched down at the water's edge. From that distance, and in the dim light, it really did look like a black bear. I wasn't particularly alarmed. I was in my truck with the doors locked, and bears are common enough in British Columbia. I figured it would wander off once it realized I was there, but then it stood up. Even now, describing this makes my stomach tighten. This thing just unfolded itself. That's the only word I can think of. It went from a crouched position to standing upright in one fluid motion, and I realized immediately that I wasn't looking at a bear. Bears don't stand like that. Even when they rear up on their hind legs, there's something distinctly bear-like about the posture. This was different. This stood fully upright like a man, but it was massive. I'm not good at estimating heights, especially at night and at that distance, but it towered over anything I'd ever seen in those woods. At least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees. For maybe 3 seconds it just stood there, perfectly still, its back to me. I remember noticing how the moonlight caught its outline. It was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not patchy like a mangy bear, but a uniform coat that seemed to ripple slightly in the night air. Then it turned. Not fully toward me, but enough that I could see its profile. The head sat directly on the shoulders, no visible neck. Its face was in shadow, but I could make out a pronounced brow ridge and what seemed like a flattened nose. My headlights were still trained on the area, but the figure stood at the edge of the beam's reach. It seemed aware of the light, but not alarmed by it. I sat completely frozen in my truck, coffee forgotten in my hand, too shocked to even think about starting the engine or driving away. What happened next has replayed in my mind countless times over the decades. The figure turned away from the water and began walking toward the tree line. Not rushing, not running, just walking with purpose. Its gait was what convinced me this wasn't a man in a costume or some kind of prank. Each stride covered far more ground than a human step would. Its arms swayed in a peculiar, pendulum-like motion that seemed both efficient and alien. I noticed how its knees bent differently than a human's, almost like its legs had an extra joint. And despite its size, it moved with an eerie gracefulness. Each footfall seemed deliberate and silent. No crashing through underbrush, no snapping twigs. Just smooth, purposeful movement. It reached the edge of the forest and paused. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to turn and look directly at me. Instead, it simply stepped between 2 massive firs and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. my knuckles white around the steering wheel that I didn't even remember grabbing. My coffee had spilled across my jeans, but I hadn't noticed until that moment. The hot liquid had already cooled against my leg. My first coherent thought was to get out of there fast. I put the truck in gear and peeled out of that rest stop, gravel flying. I drove all the way back to Vancouver without stopping once, constantly checking my rearview mirror as if expecting to see that figure loping after me on the highway. When I got home around 1 a.m., my wife was asleep. I didn't wake her. I sat in our kitchen until sunrise, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. In the light of day, I started second-guessing myself. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe the shadows and moonlight played tricks on my tired eyes. Maybe I dozed off briefly and dreamed the whole thing. But I know what I saw. The deliberate way it moved, the impossible length of its stride, the way it carried itself, not like any animal I'd ever encountered in 2 decades of working in those forests. The next day I called in sick. I couldn't face going to work, couldn't handle normal conversation. My wife knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her yet. I was afraid she'd think I was crazy or had been drinking. It took 3 days before I finally described what I'd seen. To her credit, she didn't laugh or dismiss it. She just listened, and then asked me if I wanted to report it to someone. I didn't. Who would I tell? The local police would think I was nuts. Park rangers might take it more seriously, but what could they do? And I definitely didn't want my name associated with a Bigfoot sighting in the newspapers. I had a reputation to maintain, a business to run, so I kept quiet. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to Pine Creek Rest Area in broad daylight. It looked so ordinary, so harmless. I walked down to the lake and found the spot where I believed the figure had been standing. The ground was damp from recent rain, but I didn't see any unusual tracks or signs. What did I expect to find after a week of November weather? I searched the edge of the forest where it had disappeared. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken branches, no tufts of fur, no evidence at all that anything unusual had passed through. Just the same ancient forest that had stood there for centuries. Over the following months, I read everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. Most accounts seemed far-fetched, the product of overactive imaginations or publicity seekers, but a very few, described exactly what I had seen. The height, the gait, the way the arms swung, the strange fluid movement that didn't match any known animal. I found myself studying the faces of people who claimed similar encounters. Did they have the same haunted look I sometimes caught in my own reflection? Did they also lie awake at night, replaying those moments, questioning their own perception? For years afterward, I avoided driving that stretch of highway after dark. When work required me to travel to Whistler, I'd make damn sure to leave early enough to pass through Squamish in daylight. My wife noticed but never pressed me on it. She understood that whatever I'd seen had affected me deeply. The strangest part is how that brief encounter, it couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds from first sighting to when it disappeared into the trees, fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. I'd spent my entire life in those forests, feeling at home among the trees. After that night, I never felt quite the same comfort in the woods. Always looking over my shoulder, always listening for heavy footsteps or the crack of breaking branches. I'm retired now, living in a suburb of Vancouver. I still hike occasionally, still fish in the mountain streams, but I never stay past sunset, never camp overnight. Some part of me is always alert, always watching the tree line, always wondering if I'm being observed from the shadows. What bothers me most after all these years isn't the fear I felt that night. It's the certainty that whatever I saw was simply going about its business, getting a drink, maybe hunting, moving through its territory when our paths briefly crossed. It showed no aggression, no particular interest in me or my truck. It was just existing. In a forest, I thought I knew completely. How many times had I walked those same woods, thinking I was alone? How many times had something been watching me from just beyond my field of vision? How much do we really know about what lives in the spaces we rarely visit? I'm 68 years old now. I've never seen anything like it again, despite spending 4 more decades in the British Columbia wilderness. Sometimes I almost convince myself it never happened. Almost. But then I'll be driving somewhere at dusk and catch a glimpse of something moving between distant trees. Probably just a deer. Probably just shadows. Probably. But I don't stop to check anymore. I just keep driving, a little faster than before, with one eye on the rearview mirror until I'm back in the safety of civilization. That night at Pine Creek changed something fundamental in how I understand the world. There are things in those ancient forests that don't appear in any wildlife guide, things that have managed to remain hidden despite centuries of human encroachment, things that move through the darkness with purpose and intelligence, glimpsed only by accident and good timing. And sometimes, on cold November nights when the moon is full, I still wake up sweating, convinced that if I look out my bedroom window, I'll see a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of our yard, watching my house with patient, ancient eyes. Story 13. I've never told this story to many people. My wife knows, my brother knows, and I tried telling the local sheriff back then, but I could tell from his face he thought I was just another drunk making up stories. I wasn't drunk, though, not that night, and it's been 42 years now, but I still remember it like it happened yesterday. It was October 1981. I was 28 years old, working at the paper mill about 30 miles outside of Caslow. I had picked up an extra shift that day, which is why I was driving back so late. Usually I'd be home by 7, but that night I was heading back around 11 p.m. The mill was paying time and a half for overtime, and with the baby on the way, Linda and I needed every penny we could get. The night was particularly dark. It was a new moon, and out in the country like that with no streetlights for miles, all you could see was what your headlights showed you. I was driving my old Ford pickup, a 76 that had seen better days, but the heat worked and the radio mostly did too, which was all I needed. I remember I was listening to the late-night call-in show on KBCY. Some guy was talking about how he thought the Russians were putting mind-control chemicals in our water. I wasn't really paying attention to his nonsense, just keeping myself awake on that long stretch of Highway 16, where there's nothing but trees and the occasional dirt road leading off to who knows where. You get used to seeing deer and the occasional fox when you drive that road regularly. I'd even seen a couple bears over the years, but that night, I wasn't thinking about animals at all. I was just tired, thinking about getting home, taking a shower to wash off the paper pulp smell that always stuck to my clothes, and crawling into bed next to Linda. I had just passed the mile marker that meant I was about 2 miles outside of Caslow. There's that long curve that straightens out before the bridge over Miller Creek. I'd driven it 1,000 times. I knew every pothole and crack in that asphalt. The radio was starting to get staticky. It always did in that spot, so I reached down to adjust it. That's when my headlights caught something moving at the edge of the road up ahead. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around there all the time, and occasionally they wander onto the road. But as I got closer, I realized whatever it was too tall for a bear, way too tall. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe it was a moose. We don't get many that far south, but it wasn't impossible. But then it stepped fully into the road, and I hit the brakes hard enough that my toolbox in the back slid forward and banged against the cab. This thing, and I don't know what else to call it, was walking on 2 legs, not like a bear occasionally does when it stands up to look around. It was walking upright, like a person walks, but it wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. It was huge. I'm 6'1", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe even 8. And it was broad, wide shoulders, thick arms and legs. The whole body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. In the headlights, it looked dark brown. or maybe black. It was hard to tell exactly with just the headlights illuminating it. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward. It moved smoothly, purposefully, crossing the road with long strides. The arms swung slightly, just like a person's would when walking. I was maybe 50 feet away when it stepped onto the road, and it crossed completely in about 3 seconds. It never looked at me or my truck, never acknowledged the headlights or the sound of my engine. It just crossed and disappeared into the trees on the other side. The whole thing probably lasted less than 5 seconds, but in that moment, time seemed to stretch out. I remember my heart pounding in my ears. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I wasn't breathing. When it disappeared into the trees, I just sat there for a minute, my truck idling in the middle of the empty road. I remember thinking I should follow it, should at least get out and look, but something in me said that was a really bad idea. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep driving. So that's what I did. I drove into Caslow, probably faster than I should have on those roads. When I got home, Linda was already asleep. I didn't wake her up. What would I even say? "Hey, honey, I just saw Bigfoot." She'd think I was crazy or that I'd stopped at Merle's bar on the way home. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a bear, or maybe some guy in the woods playing a prank, but I knew better. The way it moved, the proportions of its body, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. I did go to Sheriff Denton the next day. He was an old-timer who'd been sheriff since before I was born. I figured if anyone would know about strange things in the woods, it would be him. I'll never forget the look on his face when I told him. Not surprise, not disbelief. Something else, like resignation mixed with annoyance. He wrote down what I said in a little notebook, asked if I'd been drinking. I hadn't, and then told me he'd look into it. But I could tell he was just humoring me. As I was leaving his office, he called after me. "Jim," he said, "some things are better left alone, especially things in those woods at night." That stuck with me. It wasn't what I expected him to say. It wasn't dismissive exactly. It was almost like a warning. For the next few weeks, I took a different route home from work, adding about 15 minutes to my drive. I told Linda it was because of road work, but the truth was, I didn't want to drive that stretch of Highway 16 after dark. When I finally got up the courage to go back to that spot, it was during daylight hours on a Saturday. I parked my truck on the shoulder and walked into the woods where I'd seen the thing disappear. There wasn't much to see, just the usual forest floor, fallen logs, pine needles. But then I noticed something odd. About 20 yards in, there was a clear path through the underbrush. Not a human trail. It was too erratic. And in places whatever made it had pushed through dense brush rather than going around. The broken branches were high up, higher than a man would break them, and in one muddy patch there was what might have been a footprint. It was partially filled with water and not very distinct, but it was big, much bigger than my boot. I didn't go any further. That feeling came over me again, that warning in my gut that I shouldn't be there. I went back to my truck and drove home, and I never went looking again. Over the years I heard other stories, never directly, always a friend of a friend who saw something strange in the woods. Most people around here don't talk about it openly. It's like an unspoken rule. But occasionally, especially when the bars are closing or around campfires, the stories come out. Old man Gunderson claimed he found a deer carcass up in a tree, 15 feet off the ground, torn apart in a way no mountain lion would do. The Peterson boys said they heard screams in the woods behind their farm that didn't sound human or animal. And once in a while, someone reports seeing something tall moving through the trees at dusk. The area has changed a lot since 1981. They widened Highway 16 in 97, cut down a lot of the old-growth forest to make room. The paper mill closed in 2005, and a lot of people moved away. Caslow's half the size it was back then. But those woods are still there, still deep and dark beyond the road, and sometimes when I have to drive home late, I still speed up on that stretch where it happened. I still find myself scanning the tree line, watching for movement. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't have a fancy name for it or a theory about where it came from. All I know is that it was real. It was there, and for a brief moment, our worlds crossed. It went back to its world in the deep woods, and I went back to mine. But I've never stopped wondering about it, never stopped playing those few seconds over in my mind. What if I had gotten out of my truck? What if I had followed it into the woods? Would anyone have ever found me? Or would I have just become another story people tell around here? The guy who went into the woods one night and never came out. Linda says I should let it go. It was over 40 years ago after all. But how do you let go of something like that? When you see something that shouldn't exist, that changes everything you thought you knew about the world, how do you just move on? I still drive that road sometimes. The forest has grown back around the widened highway. The newer trees are smaller, but they're thick enough now that you can't see far beyond the shoulder. I always slow down at that spot, right past the mile marker, where the road curves before straightening out at Miller Creek. Sometimes I think about pulling over, walking into those trees again, calling out to it, but I never do. Some part of me is still afraid, not just of the creature, but of knowing for sure. Because as long as I don't know exactly what's in those woods, I can still pretend it was just a trick of the light, a tired mind, seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I know what I saw. Something not human, not animal. At least not any animal we have names for. Something that walked like a man, but wasn't a man. Something that, for all I know, is still out there in those woods, still crossing that road late at night when no one's watching. Except sometimes someone is watching. Someone like me, just trying to get home after a long day, who happens to be in the wrong place, or maybe the right place, at exactly the moment when whatever lives in those woods decides to cross the road. And if you're ever driving that stretch of Highway 16 outside of Caslow late at night, keep your eyes on the road ahead. But also watch the trees, watch for movement, because I wasn't the first to see it, and I doubt I was the last. Some things have been in these woods a lot longer than we have, and I think they'll be here long after we're gone. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I know it saw me too. Story 14. I've never told this story online before, but I need to get this off my chest. It happened on January 30th, 1982. I was 13 years old. That day changed me forever, and even though it's been over 40 years, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My name's Van. Back then I lived in a small town called Sanageton in British Columbia. Not many people have heard of it, and that's probably for the best. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and kids could play outside without parents worrying too much. I spent most weekends with my friends Tony and Larry. Tony was only 9, just a little kid really, and Larry was 12. We were just normal boys who liked exploring the woods, building forts, and pretending we were on adventures. That Saturday started like any other winter day in BC. It was cold but not freezing, maybe around 40 degrees. There was no snow on the ground, just damp earth and wet leaves everywhere. My mom had made me wear this stupid red knit hat that I hated, but I was glad for it later. We met up at the corner of Maple and Pine around 10 in the morning. Larry had brought his slingshot, and Tony had a bag of chips he was already halfway through. We didn't have a plan, really, just headed toward the woods on the edge of town, where we usually played. There was this area about a mile in with a small clearing that we called our base. We'd spent the previous summer building a half-decent fort there, with fallen branches and some old plywood we'd dragged from Larry's backyard. The woods were pretty quiet that day. Usually you'd hear birds or the occasional rabbit rustling through the underbrush, but something felt different. I remember thinking it was strange, but didn't say anything to the guys. Didn't want them calling me a scaredy cat. We got to our fort around 11 and just hung out for a while. Larry was showing us how he'd improved his slingshot aim by practicing on cans in his backyard. Tony was collecting weird-shaped sticks, something he always did. I was just sitting on this fallen log, carving my initials with my pocket knife, the one my dad had given me for Christmas that my mum didn't know about. That's when we first heard it. It was this deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere north of our clearing. At first, I thought it might be Mr. Johnson's dog. He had this huge German shepherd that sometimes got loose and roamed the woods. But this sound was different, lower, more, I don't know, guttural. "What was that?" Tony asked, dropping his sticks. "Probably just a dog," Larry said, but I could tell by his face he didn't believe it. We heard it again, and this time it was louder. It didn't sound like any animal I knew from around those parts. "Let's go check it out," I said, trying to sound brave. Looking back, that was the stupidest suggestion I've ever made. We followed the sound deeper into the woods, away from our fort and the path that led back to town. The trees got thicker here, and less sunlight came through. The ground was mushy under our sneakers, and it smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Tony grabbed my jacket sleeve. "I'm scared, Van," he whispered. "Don't be a baby," Larry shot back, but I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his slingshot. That's when we heard the growl again, this time so close it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was coming from just beyond a dense row of pine trees ahead of us. "Let's go back," Tony pleaded. I almost agreed, but then I saw something move between the trees. It was just for a second, an arm, I think, a massive hairy arm, swinging as something stepped onto the narrow trail about 50 feet ahead of us. We froze, all three of us, just stood there like statues as it came into full view. I've seen bears. I've seen moose. I've seen every wild animal you'd expect in the BC woods. This wasn't any of those. It was huge, standing at least 8 feet tall, maybe even 10. Its body was covered in thick, matted hair that looked grayish-black in the filtered forest light. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like hands with actual fingers, not paws. Its legs were massive and powerful-looking, bent slightly at the knees like it was ready to lunge. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes were set deep under a prominent brow, and they looked intelligent. That's what scared me the most. There was something thinking behind those eyes. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Us three terrified boys and this thing. Then it took a step toward us. That broke the spell. We ran. Oh God, we ran like our lives depended on it, because I truly believe they did. Tony started crying as we sprinted back the way we came. Larry was right behind me, breathing so hard I could hear him over my own pounding heartbeat. I glanced back once, just once, and saw it moving toward us with these long, swinging strides. It wasn't running exactly, more like loping, but it was fast, too fast for something that big. "Don't look back!" I screamed at the others. "Just run!" We crashed through the underbrush, not caring about the path anymore, just trying to get away. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like rubber, but pure terror kept me going. Tony fell once, and Larry and I each grabbed an arm and practically carried him for a few yards until he got his footing again. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like forever. Eventually, we burst out of the tree line and into Old Man Creedy's field on the edge of town. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where we finally collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. Did you see that?" Larry panted, his face ghost white. Tony was sobbing, his knees pulled up to his chest. "It was coming for us," he kept saying. "It was coming for us." I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and my whole body was trembling. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, those knowing eyes. When we finally caught our breath, we made a pact to tell our parents. We were sure they'd call the police, organize a search party, do something. But when we got home and told them, they reacted exactly how you'd expect adults to react to 3 hysterical boys. with wild tales. "Just your imagination," my dad said, barely looking up from his newspaper. "Probably saw a bear," Larry's mom suggested. "You boys and your stories," Tony's parents laughed, "but we knew what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't our imagination." The next day, Larry came to my house early. His eyes were red like he hadn't slept, which made two of us. He said we should tell the police ourselves. So we rode our bikes to the station, all three of us. The officer at the desk, Officer Brannigan, took our statement. But I could tell by the way he kept looking at the clock that he wasn't taking us seriously. "Bears can stand on their hind legs," he explained patiently, "can look mighty human-like in the right light." "It wasn't a bear," Larry insisted. "Bears don't have hands with fingers. Bears don't walk on two legs for that long." Officer Brannigan just smiled, that patronizing smile adults give kids. "I'll make a note of it, boys. You stay out of those woods for a while, okay?" We left feeling defeated. No one was going to believe us. A few days later, this guy showed up in town. John Green, he said his name was. Turned out he was some kind of researcher who collected stories about strange creatures in the woods. Someone at the police station must have tipped him off about our report. He interviewed each of us separately, which I thought was smart. He didn't ask leading questions or suggest what we might have seen. He just listened as we described every detail we could remember. When he asked me to point out on a map exactly where we'd encountered the creature, I did so without hesitation. Later, he told me Larry had picked the exact same spot, down to the specific bend in the trail. Green was the first adult who didn't dismiss us outright. He took measurements at the site, looked for tracks, though the ground was too hard and leaf-covered to show much, and even collected some hair samples from a broken branch that might have been nothing. He said he'd send them to a lab for analysis, but we never heard the results. The weeks following were hard. Word got around school about our monster sighting, and the teasing was relentless. "Watch out for Bigfoot!" kids would yell as we walked down the hall. Even teachers would sometimes make little jokes about it. Tony took it the hardest. He started having nightmares and wouldn't go outside alone, even in broad daylight. His parents eventually sent him to talk to someone in the city, a child psychologist, I think. After a few sessions, he stopped talking about what we saw, just clammed up completely whenever anyone mentioned it. I think they convinced him it was all in his head. Larry held firm for a while, but eventually started saying maybe it was just a bear. The pressure got to him, I guess. By summer, he was telling people he'd made up the whole thing as a prank. I knew he was lying. You don't forget the look of sheer terror I saw on his face that day. But I understood why he did it. It was easier than dealing with the ridicule, but I knew what I saw. I still know. I never went back to that part of the woods again. None of us did. My family moved away from Sacramento the following year, and I lost touch with Tony and Larry. I sometimes wonder if they still remember, or if they've fully convinced themselves it never happened. For years, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was some hermit living in the woods. Maybe it was just the overactive imagination of three young boys. But deep down, I know better. The way it moved, those eyes, the intelligence behind them. No bear has eyes like that. No human is built like that. Whatever we saw that day was something else. I've thought about going back to Sacramento, finding that spot again as an adult. But what would be the point? The forest has probably changed in 40 years, and honestly, part of me is still afraid of what I might find. I looked up John Green a few years back, curious about what became of his research. Turns out he was pretty well known in cryptozoology circles, wrote some books about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. I wonder if our encounter made it into one of his case files somewhere. I've never been a believer in the supernatural or conspiracy theories. I'm actually pretty skeptical by nature, but I know what I saw that day. All three of us saw it. Sometimes when I'm hiking or camping with my own kids now, I catch myself scanning the tree line, listening for sounds that don't belong. My wife thinks I'm being overly cautious about wildlife, and I let her believe that. It's easier than explaining. I still wake up sometimes with the image of those eyes fresh in my mind, intelligent, aware, watching us. And I wonder if somewhere in the forests of British Columbia, that thing is still out there, still watching, still waiting. And I wonder if anyone would believe me, even now. Story 15. I still can't believe what Frank and I saw that day. It's been over a year now, but I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I've never told anyone outside my immediate family, and even they looked at me like I was nuts. I finally decided to write this all down because I need to tell somebody who might actually believe me. This happened on June 10th last year, 1982. When my buddy Frank Meir and I were heading up to our favorite fishing spot north of Fernie, British Columbia. We've been hunting and fishing those woods for nearly 20 years, so we know the area like the back of our hands. I was driving my old Ford pickup that day. It's not much to look at, but it's gotten me through those logging roads more times than I can count. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon, clear skies, perfect day. We were about 10 miles north of Fernie on that narrow dirt road they call Forestry Road 7. You know the type, gravel and dirt, barely maintained, with thick forest pressing in from both sides. We'd been bullshitting about Frank's new fishing rod and how his wife was giving him grief about spending the money on it. We came around this sharp bend in the road. There's a big Douglas fir on the right that's been hit by lightning years ago, so I always know exactly where we were. As we cleared that bend, I had to slam on the brakes so hard Frank nearly hit the dashboard. "What the hell, Bob?" Frank yelled, but then he saw it too and just froze. There, standing right in the middle of the damn road, not 50 feet ahead of us, was something. I've been hunting since I was 12 years old. I've seen every animal in these woods. Bears, cougars, moose, you name it. This wasn't any of those. It was standing on two legs like a man, but bigger. Not giant like you hear in those crazy stories. I'd say just over 6 feet tall, but broad. Really broad shoulders. The whole thing was covered in this short, reddish-brown hair, like a rusty color, but natural-looking, not bright. The hair looked maybe 3-4 inches long, and it covered everything except its face and hands. The face and hands were this dark, grayish color, almost black. Not fur there, but skin. I couldn't make out facial features too clearly at that distance, but it had a flat, wide nose and deep-set eyes. For a second, we just sat there in the truck, engine idling, and this creature just stood there too. Then it turned its head and looked right at us. I swear to God it looked right at us, like it was sizing us up. Its movements weren't jerky like an animal's. They were smooth, deliberate, human-like. Those 2 seconds felt like forever. I remember my hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and I couldn't even blink. Frank wasn't breathing next to me. The only sound was the engine rumbling. Then, without any warning, this thing turned away from us and started running down the road ahead of the truck. It didn't run like a bear on hind legs, or like a person either. It was this weird loping gait, powerful but smooth. Its arms swung at its sides, not flailing wildly, but controlled, like a runner's would be. "Holy shit," Frank whispered. "Holy shit, Bob, are you seeing this?" I didn't answer. I just hit the gas. I don't know what possessed me to chase after it. Adrenaline, curiosity, disbelief, all of it mixed together probably. The truck lurched forward, tires kicking up dust and gravel as we started gaining on it. This thing was fast. Maybe 20-25 miles per hour. But my truck could do better on that stretch. As we got within 30 feet of it, I could see the muscles working under that hair, the way its shoulders moved. That's when I knew for sure it wasn't a guy in a suit. No costume moves like that. We've shot enough deer and gutted enough animals to know what muscle and sinew look like in motion. Just as we were getting close, maybe 20 feet behind it, the creature suddenly veered left. It didn't slow down at all. It just made this sharp turn and leaped off the road. And when I say leaped, I mean leaped. It cleared the ditch beside the road and basically flew into the trees. It was the most incredible jump I've ever seen anything make. We're talking easily 15 feet across and down an embankment. I slammed on the brakes again, and we both sat there for a few seconds, just breathing hard and staring at the spot where it disappeared. "What the fuck was that?" Frank kept saying. "What the fuck was that, Bob?" I put the truck in park and we both got out. My legs felt rubbery, like after you've had a close call on the highway. We walked over to where the thing had jumped off the road. The embankment there drops about 8 or 9 feet down from the road level to the forest floor. There, in the dirt and pine needles, were these skid marks, long scrapes in the ground where something heavy had landed and then pushed off. Frank pointed at them. "No human could jump like that and land there. Look at how deep those marks are. Whatever that was, it's heavy." We stood there for a minute, both of us just staring down that embankment. The forest beyond was thick with pine and underbrush. Looking into it from the bright sunlight of the road, it was just shadows and green darkness. "Should we go after it?" Frank asked, but I could tell by his voice he didn't really want to. I didn't either. "With what? We don't even have our rifles." We'd only brought fishing gear that day, planning to catch some trout up at Parker Lake. We climbed down the embankment anyway, careful not to mess up the skid marks. Both of us were looking for footprints, but the ground was covered in pine needles and wasn't soft enough to show clear tracks. Still, there were disturbed areas, places where the needles had been pushed aside by something moving fast. "You think it's a Sasquatch?" Frank finally said the word we'd both been avoiding. He tried to laugh when he said it, but it came out all wrong. "I don't know what the hell to think," I told him honestly. "But it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person." We followed the direction it had gone for maybe 50 yards into the woods, but there was nothing to see. No broken branches at head height, which seemed strange for something that tall moving fast. It was like it knew how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. The deeper we got into the trees, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing, and I swear I could feel something watching us. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. "This is stupid," Frank said suddenly, voicing what I was thinking. "We don't know what that thing is, or if it's alone." He was right. We were two middle-aged guys with nothing but pocket knives, chasing something we couldn't identify into dense forest. We headed back to the truck. Once we were sitting in the cab again, the reality of what we'd seen started to sink in. I was shaking a little, and I could see Frank was too. "We should report this," he said. "Call the RCMP when we get back to town." I thought about that for a minute. "And tell them what? That we saw a Sasquatch? They'll think we're crazy or drunk." "We know what we saw, Bob." "Yeah, but nobody else is going to believe it. No pictures, no real tracks. Just our word that we saw some hairy thing running on 2 legs. We sat there for a while longer, engine off, just processing. I kept replaying the image of that thing looking at us. There was intelligence in that look, awareness. That's what keeps bothering me to this day. "Let's go fishing," I finally said. "We came all this way." Frank looked at me like I was insane. "You still want to fish? After that? What else are we going to do? Go home? Tell our wives we got scared by Bigfoot?" I was trying to make it sound like a joke, but my voice was too tight. We ended up continuing to the lake, but neither of us had our heart in it. We cast our lines and sat on the shore, but mostly we just talked about what we'd seen, going over and over the details like we might find some explanation if we described it enough times. The drive home later that afternoon was quiet. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the road, and every time we rounded a bend, I half expected to see that thing standing there again. "We should keep this between us," Frank said as we neared town. "At least for now," I agreed. My wife already thought I told too many hunting stories. This one would really make her roll her eyes. Plus, Fernie's a small place, about 200 people. Word gets around and I didn't want to be the town kook. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that creature's face turning to look at us, the deliberate way it moved. I got up around 3 a.m. and pulled out my old wildlife guide, flipping through it even though I knew damn well what we saw wasn't in any book. Over the next few days, Frank and I talked on the phone almost every night, comparing notes, making sure our memories matched up. We even drove back up there the following weekend with a camera, hoping against hope we might spot it again. We didn't, of course. I've spent my whole life in those woods. I've tracked animals, hunted them, observed them. What we saw that day doesn't fit anything I know. The way it moved, that fluid motion, and that incredible leap off the road. No human could jump like that, especially not down an embankment. I've read stories about Sasquatch sightings before, always thought they were bullshit. Campfire stories to scare kids. Now I don't know what to think. All I know is what I saw that day was real. It was alive. It was intelligent. And sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone now, I feel like I'm being watched. I hear branches snap from deeper in the trees, but there's never anything there when I look. Last month, I found strange marks on a tree near my deer stand, gouges in the bark about 7 feet up. I haven't told Frank about that. Haven't told anyone until now. I keep thinking about that look it gave us before it ran. It wasn't scared, not really. It was assessing, like it was deciding whether we were a threat. And I can't shake the feeling that we're the ones being hunted now. Something's out there in those woods. I saw it with my own eyes. And the worst part is, I think it saw me too. Really saw me. And it remembers my face just as clearly as I remember its.